Chapter 1: Ashes of Exile. The storm rolled down from the mountains like a judgment. It clawed at the city's slate roofs, flung needles of rain into alleys where the wind had no business being, and smeared the lantern light into watery halos. Selene Arkwright kept her head bowed and her hands tight around the thin shawl that did almost nothing against the cold. The city of Veyr lay under the Citadel like a penitent beneath a cathedral. Up there, somewhere inside the ring of obsidian spires, the guardian watched and the priests whispered. Down here, on the far edge where the city's stones gave way to scrub and mud, a wolfless exile tried not to count the coin in her pocket. Mira coughed against her chest, a small wet sound that didn't belong in a child's throat. Selene shifted the bundle of blankets higher, letting the girl's fevered cheek rest against the hollow of her collarbone. "Almost there," she murmured. "Stay with me, little star." Myra's breath hitched but steadied at the sound of her voice. She was light as a sigh, too light, all long lashes and hollowed cheeks, with a kind of gaze that always seemed to be listening to something Selene couldn't hear. The pawnshop sat where the edge of the city turned to the old road, its window full of other people's once precious things. A man's cane with a silver wolf's head. A music box with a missing key. A child's leather boots, outgrown and never reclaimed. The bell on the door gave a bitter, tinny ring when she shouldered it open. "Arkwright," said Master Pell from behind his glass case, as if they were old friends and not two people who only met when desperation had a face. He had a nose like a hawk's beak and hands soft from counting money. "Back so soon?" Selene slid the ring from the string around her neck. It was the last thing she had not already traded for bread, for firewood, for rent paid a few days late to a landlord who had learned to pity and resent her in equal measure. The ring sat on her palm like a sliver of moonlight, braided silver scuffed in places, the Arkwright crest engraved so shallowly you could feel it more than see it. Her mother's ring. Her grandmother's before that. "My price hasn't changed," Pell said, peering. "Silver's soft this winter. Faith even softer." "It's not faith I'm selling," Selene said, surprised by the edge in her voice. "It's a ring. And yet you wear it like a prayer." Pell's mouth made a sympathetic shape that never reached his eyes. He named a number that made her ribs tighten. "Medicine," she said. "For a child. I assume the child eats as well." He tapped his ledger with a nail. "There is the practical side of tragedy." She swallowed as if she could push down anger and taste instead the teas she brewed from willow bark and hope. "A little more, Master Pell. For the crest." "That crest means something in the mountains," he said, sliding the ring onto a cloth. "But you were cast out of the mountains, weren't you? No wolf, no howl, no name. Down here it's just a pattern." He added 3 thin coins to the pile as if they were an indulgence. "Be thankful. Silver tarnishes in a storm." Selene took the coins and pretended they didn't burn. She never told the truth of that day to anyone. The long walk down out of the snowline, the pack's eyes on her back, a council's verdict. Wolfless. An Arkwright in name only. They had given her a small bag of food and a winter cloak, and the kindest of them had said, "Live, Selene. Make a life." As if saying it made it possible. Outside the pawnshop the storm had thickened. The Citadel spires were just shapes in the dark, the great river a chain of steel under the bridges. Selene bought tinctures from the apothecary, a woman with wise hands and a tongue too sharp for pity, then bread so stale it cut like a crust of glass. When she reached her room above the cooper's yard, she was soaked through and shivering, but Myra's forehead cooled a little after the first drops touched her tongue, and that was worth any storm. The room was a square of thin walls and careful neatness, a bed pushed against the corner to keep away drafts, a table with 2 mismatched cups, a braided rug she had woven from scraps to remind herself that making something new from broken pieces was a kind of magic of its own. Selene lit the lamp, switched her shawl for a dry one, and tucked Mira in under the blanket that still smelled faintly of sun, faintly of summer. The girl's lashes fluttered. "A story," she whispered. Only if you close your eyes, Selene said, tucking a curl behind her ear. A short one. About a fox who stole the moon. Mira smiled, small and sleepy. Selene told it the way she always did. The fox clever, the moon lonely, the night softer for the company. She knew it by heart and could braid the words even while fear counted beats in her chest. The medicine would last 3 days. The bread would last too. Myra's cough would come back. The cough always did. And the apothecary's shelves had been sparse lately. War at the borders had meant wagons went to soldiers first and children second, if at all. I'm not a fox, Mira murmured, almost gone to sleep. But if I could, I'd steal the sun too. For you. Selene kissed her hair and tasted salt. Sleep, little star. When the child's breath finally fell into the even rhythm of dream, Selene let her shoulders slump. The lamplight had that lonely sweetness it got late at night, when the world felt small enough to hold and too large to change. She sat at the table with a ledger she kept on scraps and a nub of charcoal. The numbers were simple and merciless. The coin she had from Pell had already begun to vanish in the ink. She swallowed and forced the sum to balance. Didn't. Somewhere above the river, a bell tolled the hour. From the alley came the clatter of a cart and a burst of laughter that turned into swearing when the wheel hit a rut. Selene stood to trim the lamp, and that was when she heard it. The kind of conversation that travels on rain, stitches itself into the thread of a storm and slips through a window left a finger's width open. Told you it wasn't there, said a voice, breathless from drink or fear. The Scriptorium Below is a rumor for children. Children don't whisper ward schemes, said another. You saw the glyphs on the underside of the old stone. You smelled the ink. Blood and iron. They keep the good books where the priests can't see their spines in daylight. The guardian keeps it, the first muttered, and spit to prove he wasn't afraid. And he keeps more dangerous things than books. Rain braided the words into something strange and luminous. Selene went to the window and lifted the shutter a little higher. 2 men leaned beneath the eaves of the cooper's shed, their cloaks plastered to them, their hands cupped around the kind of bottle you finished before you thought about who you should have shared it with. Scribes, maybe, or smugglers pretending to be scribes. Their boots had the grime of the archive quarter on them. Under the Citadel, the second said, quieter now as if he remembered that even storms carried gossip home. Where the Scriptorium Below sits like a shadow under a shadow. They have recipes in those stacks, Tolan. Truths the priests forgot on purpose. The kind of ink that writes on bone. Even if it's real, said Tolan. What use is a book you can't reach? Ladders, the other said, and laughed at his own joke, then sobered. Tunnels, fool. The old aqueduct. The city's spine. It all runs to the Citadel. And if you know which rung to pull beside the tannery, the wall opens like a mouth. They went on to argue about the price of secrets until the cart's owner kicked them out from under his eaves and the storm swallowed their words whole. Selene let the shutter fall and stood very still. Under the Citadel, a library that did not love the day. Recipes in its dark for healing and for harm. A tunnel for a spine, a mouth and a wall. She knew the sound of a trap when she heard one, but she also knew when a door had been left ajar by chance or by mercy. Desperation lifted its head and looked through her eyes. The apothecary sold her tinctures that softened coughs. The priest sold the idea that suffering refined souls like iron. Neither had yet offered a cure. Selene sat. She pressed her palms flat to the table as if bracing it against the sea. If she had a wolf, this is the moment it would have raised its ears, prowled the line between fear and hunger, tasted the storm and decided. But her blood was quiet, her skin just skin. Wolfless, the council had named her, like a bell rung 3 times. The word still stung sometimes, a burr that worked its way back through cloth. It had not killed her. It had taught her the weight of her own bones. She folded the ledger, cleaned the charcoal from her fingers, and moved through the small rituals that steadied her. Cup washed, lamp trimmed, mirror checked again, coin hidden in the loose brick, knife under the pillow. She set her mother's ringless string back against her throat by force of habit, and felt the absence like a cold place in summer. In the dark glass of the window she saw her reflection, the sharpness the mountains had carved into her cheekbones, the mouth set like she was forever about to say no. No, she thought. Not forever. She slept briefly and badly, the storm talking in its sleep, the city answering in creaks and sighs. By dawn, the rain had gentled to a sullen drizzle. Selene tucked Mira under her best blanket, warmed stones at the brazier and wrapped them in cloth for the girl's feet, then left a note for the cooper's wife, who had a soft heart and a louder voice and would knock on the door if Mira called. Selene pulled on her boots, shoved a coil of rope and a stub of candle into her satchel, and tied the shawl tight enough that breathing required intention. The tannery district sat downstream of everything, as if the city had decided that was where its hard truths should settle. The smell went through cloth and bone. It made the air feel heavier and your eyes sting. Selene walked with her head up anyway. The streets here were a puzzle of gutter and plank, and you learned quick where the boards were slippery. She had been in Veyr long enough to understand that every beautiful thing floated on something unmentionable, and the people who kept it afloat were always wet to their knees. She found the alley she hadn't known she was looking for. It was narrow as a breath held too long, wedged between a wall stained the color of old coins and a stack of pallets that had lived several lives. At the end of it, a stretch of stone set deeper than the rest, slick with moss carved once, long ago, with something a generation had half remembered and misread as decor. Selene crouched. The glyphs were almost gone, but her fingers traced the ghost of a spiral, a pair of mirrored sigils that made her skin buzz faintly. A rung to pull, the drunk had said. A mouth in the wall. Up close, she saw the iron ring set waist-high where the moss grew thinnest. It had been painted over a dozen times by men who saw iron and thought anchor, not door. Her heart made a steady, stubborn sound. "If you're a story," she whispered, "tell me a true one." She took the ring in both hands. Did not move at first. Then something inside the wall sighed, a gravelly sound, half resentful, half relieved, and the stone shifted. Dust fell like old breath. The seam became a crack, the crack a thin blackness you could slide a promise through. Selene paused and turned her face up into the drizzle. From here, she could just see the Citadel's lowest wall, a dark line against a paler sky. The Guardian lived there, if one could call that living. Caelan Duskbane, the city called him, in the Tone cities reserved for saints and monsters. She had never seen him close. Few had. Stories hung on his name like wet clothes. That he could call wolves from the hills with a word, that he was never seen at noon, that he had burned a plague out of the river and left the stones too hot to touch for a week. Stories were a currency that inflated without warning. Selene did not build her life with them. Still, she felt the way a room feels when someone you love is about to open the door. A catch in the air, a waiting. Might have been fear. Might have been hope. The difference was an arrow's width and mattered too much to measure. He pushed. The wall opened enough to let a determined woman through if she turned sideways and didn't mind stone kissing her shoulders. Cold air exhaled from the dark, damp and smelling of iron and old ink. Her candle's flame trembled and then steadied. Selene set one foot on the stair and then the other. The stone under her boots was slick in places and worn in others, grooved by centuries of feet, some running, some creeping, some bravely pretending not to do either. She closed the door behind her with a soft, treacherous thud. The storm became a memory at once. Sound changed shape in the tunnel, went closer, sharper. Somewhere in the deep, water talked to itself. Somewhere nearer, a rat considered politics and decided against her. Selene touched the wall as she went, letting her palm collect the damp chill, the crumbling grit. She counted her steps because counting was a spell that kept other thoughts out. At 30, the stair opened onto a low passage. At 50, a split in the stone gave her a choice. The right-hand path smelled like mildew and something that had been rope. The left smelled faintly of ink, faintly of oil, the language of machines and books. She went left. Her candlelight brushed across old carvings and startled a cluster of pale insects into motion. She passed an arch where someone long dead had chiseled a prayer and someone more recently alive had added a joke. She passed a collapsed shelf and what might have been a boot once, ornate and mold-eaten. She hugged herself and kept going until the passage turned and the air changed, tasted suddenly of copper and damp paper and the kind of quiet that is made by deliberate hands. A doorway lay ahead, not a door. There was nothing to close, only threshold. Beyond it, Selene saw a room like a well laid sideways. It fell away into darkness stacked with shelves, and each shelf held the sullen shine of oilskin and wax. Books slept there, wrapped and labeled, and the labels were written in a hand that didn't expect to be read by fools. She stood on the threshold and let the sight settle under her ribs. It was smaller than she had imagined and larger. A hidden room under a fortress, a quiet under the city's clamor, a place where someone had fought the damp for years and sometimes won. She took one careful step onto the stone floor, then another. The candle's flame gilded the dust on the nearest label and picked out a word she knew and a word she didn't. Remedies. Ikra. Selene set the candle on the lip of a shelf and reached for the nearest bundle. The twine that tied it had been knotted by a steady hand and cut by a reluctant one. She recognized the shape of second thoughts. She loosened it with the ease of a woman who had untied too many things meant to last forever. The book inside was surprisingly warm. She opened it. The first page had been written by a careful scribe with such close, crabbed letters that the words looked like a hedge no wind could pass. Her eyes found their pathway anyway. Sleep teas, febrifuge, the ratio of willow to mint in fevers that come and go like tides. Familiar things, reassuring in their familiarity and therefore unsatisfactory. The next page turned, and the one after that. Somewhere between a treatise on lung fire and a warning about nightshade's vanity, a set of lines snagged her breath. A draft infused in the dark, inked with a sigil she had seen in the mountain healer's hut only once, on the day her mother died. "Don't you dare," she whispered, but the memory came anyway, whole as a bell. Her mother's hands drawing that same mirrored curve over a bowl of steam, the air heavy with time and grief. "For stubborn lungs," she had said, and looked at Selene with a love that had not known she would be leaving it behind so soon. Selene closed the book carefully, then opened it again as if to prove the past could be made obedient. The recipe was there. The ingredients were not impossible. The method wanted more darkness than she had brought and a patience she could learn. Her throat tightened. Her eyes smarted at the smoke she told herself didn't exist. In the shift of her gaze she noticed a second thing. A sigil scrawled in the margin in a different hand. Not careful, urgent. The ink had blotted at the end as if the pen had been snatched back mid-word. A warning. A refinement. The mark was similar to the one near the wall above. Spiral, mirror, a line through the center like a blade made thoughtful by a flaw. She had the sense, suddenly, of being looked at. Not by eyes behind her. No breath stirred her neck, but by the place itself, as if the books had lifted their heads and were deciding. She set the volume down and tucked it slightly back, not to hide it but to say, "I will not steal what you keep safe. I will borrow. I will pay you back with care." Selene reached for twine to retie the bundle. Her fingers were steady. Her heart was not. She thought of Mira in the narrow bed, dreaming foxes stealing moons and baked bread that didn't cut the mouth. She thought of the mountain council, of the man who had said live, Selene, and might have meant you're on your own. She thought of a guardian in a fortress she could not see, a name people used to make themselves brave or cruel. Above her, so far above that the sound had to work to find her, a bell marked the hour. Here it became a different sound, older, rounder, truer. Selene tied the knot loosely, slid the book back into its sleeve, and blew out the candle. In the sudden dark the room breathed the way a sleeper does when a shutter bangs, startled and then soothed. She let the darkness hold her for a count of 10 and then relit the wick. "Despair is a door," she said softly, "but so is determination." Her mother had taught her that. So had the world. She turned toward the passage she had come through and listened one last time to the hush of paper, to the hush of stone. Then she tucked the book under her arm, not to keep, only to bring back before dawn, and began the climb toward the life she still meant to make. The stair received her footfalls the way the sea takes oars, by admitting there will be work. Behind her, in the scriptorium below, ink dried on a margin that had not been touched in years, as if something had nodded in the dark. Selene kept count in her head, 12, 20, 32, and when she reached the iron ring she pressed her ear to the seam. Rain still fell outside. The city still stank of leather and ward ash and rain. Somewhere up there a child shifted in sleep and reached for a woman who wasn't a fox but would steal a son if that was what it took. Selene braced her shoulder against the stone and pushed. The wall's mouth opened again, and the storm came in like a long-held breath. "Almost there," she whispered to the air that would carry her words back to the room above the cooper's yard. She slipped out into the alley, pulled the wall closed with both hands, and let the ring settle back against the moss. By the time she turned toward home, the drizzle had become rain again, washing the tannery's stink into rivulets. She walked fast, clutching the wrapped book and her shawl tight, and when the wind rose at the corner she didn't bow her head. The Citadel's spires hoisted themselves out of the mist and watched her go, patient as knives. In the morning, she would brew something that smelled like thyme and old courage. In the evening, if the fever broke, she would tell Mira a new story. Not about a fox this time, but about a girl who found a door that had been hiding as a wall and chose to open it. The city did not change its step to greet her. But under the stone, where secrets waited in a careful hush, something had already begun to move. Chapter 2. The Guardian in the Shadows. The storm had broken by dawn, but its voice lingered in the gutters and cisterns, muttering like an old prophet who refused to be silenced. Selene returned to the hidden stair that evening, the book wrapped in a cloth and pressed against her ribs. Mira had slept easier under the bitter draught she had brewed at first light. It was not a cure, but it was a reprieve, and reprieves were the currency of survival. Now, as twilight bled across the city and lanterns winked to life like 1,000 small prayers, Selene descended again into the dark beneath the citadel. The tunnels swallowed her candle's light greedily. The stone breathed damp air onto her skin, and water dripped in slow, arrhythmic beats, as if the city itself had a pulse. She moved with care, listening to the scrape of her own boots, clutching the wrapped book as though it were Myra's hand. The scriptorium below awaited her, heavy with silence. She lit another stub of wax and traced her way deeper, past shelves bowed beneath the weight of forgotten knowledge. She searched with urgency, following the strange sigil she had glimpsed in the margin. The shelves had no order that she could name. Remedies sat beside chronicles of war, prayers rubbed shoulders with curses, but here and there a mark appeared. Spiral mirrored glyph, a line drawn like a wound. Finally, in the lowest alcove, she found it, a fragment of vellum torn from its binding, pressed flat beneath a heavy ledger. The script shimmered faintly under moonlight that filtered through a shaft in the ceiling, its letters edged with silver like frost. Her breath caught. "A cure for lungs drowned in shadow," she whispered, tracing the ink. "Steeped with salt of the moonflower, mixed under night." Ingredients she knew, others she had never heard of. Her heart raced. This could be something. But the hush of the scriptorium shifted, like the turning of a great beast in its sleep. A shadow fell across the manuscript. Selene froze. He stood in the doorway, filling it as if the stone had shaped itself to his frame. Caelan Duskbane, the guardian of Veyr. She had heard his name spoken in taverns with reverence, in alleys with dread, but no words had prepared her for the reality of him. He was tall, broader than any soldier she had seen, his cloak trailing darkness that clung like smoke. Raven-black hair framed a face too severe to be mortal, and his eyes, gods, his eyes, burned gold even in the gloom, as if fire had been trapped in amber and given thought. The silence thickened, pressing against her ribs. Selene's candle guttered. "You should not be here." His voice was low, steady, but it shook the shelves as if the stone itself obeyed him. Selene's throat dried. She clutched the fragment closer. I meant no harm. My niece, she's sick. I only needed. You touched what is forbidden." He stepped closer, and his shadow swallowed the pale circle of her candle. "Do you know what it costs to steal from this place?" She backed away until her spine struck the edge of a shelf. Fear battled with defiance in her chest. If knowledge can save a child, then hoarding it is the crime. For the first time, something flickered in his gaze. Not mercy. Something sharper, older. "You dare!" And then it happened. Her hand brushed the edge of the shelf as she steadied herself. The wood splintered. She lurched forward, and her shoulder brushed against his arm. The world convulsed. Kalen staggered, sucking in air like a drowning man. His golden eyes flared, molten and wild. Muscles tore beneath his cloak, veins rising, claws ripping through his gloves. His jaw clenched until bone cracked. Half his face shifted, lengthening, teeth sharp as blades glinting in the wavering light. The Guardian was becoming the beast. Selene stumbled back, terror clawing at her lungs. His growl filled the scriptorium, deep, primal, shaking dust from the rafters. His claws scraped the stone, leaving gouges. "Leave," he snarled, his voice twisted, layered with something not wholly human. His chest heaved, every breath a battle against the curse that tore through him. "Before I forget myself." Selene clutched the manuscript fragment, heart hammering. The sight of him was awe and horror bound together. A man breaking apart, a god shackled in flesh, a beast that could unmake her with a single strike. She turned and ran. The shelves blurred past, the tunnel rising like a throat that wanted to choke her. Behind her, Kalen roared, a sound that was not meant for human ears. Stone shook. Her candle blew out. She fled blind, guided by the faintest memory of turns and steps, the smell of moss and tannery air. At last, the wall's iron ring met her hand. She dragged it with all her weight. The stone door shuddered, groaned, and opened just wide enough. She slipped through as claws scraped the other side. Rain lashed her face. She pulled the wall shut, pressed both palms against the cold stone, her breath a ragged sob. The manuscript fragment, her only proof, was gone. In her flight she had dropped it. She stood shaking in the tannery alley, heart still trapped in the scriptorium's darkness. The Guardian's golden eyes burned in her memory, terrible and beautiful. His voice echoed, a warning and a curse. "Before I forget myself." Selene pulled her shawl tighter and ran home to Mira, not knowing that the Guardian had already marked her scent in the shadows, and that their paths could no longer part. Chapter 3: The Beast's Chains. Morning came colorless and thin, as if the storm had wrung the city dry and left only a pale wash behind. Selene woke to the sound of Mira coughing, small sounds at first, then deeper ones that scraped at the edges of breath. The draught she'd brewed in the night had bought them a few hours of easy sleep. Now the cough was back like a debt collector who'd found the right door. "Easy," Selene whispered, lifting the child and rubbing gentle circles between her shoulders. "We're all right. We're all right." She could feel the heat on Myra's skin, the way it came and went in tides, leaving the girl shivering after each wave passed. Down in the yard, the cooper's hammer kept steady time. The city resumed its routines as if the night had been a rumor. Selene warmed water over the brazier and steeped willow bark and thyme, the scents mingling in the room that had become their world. She moved on instinct. Rinse the cloth, press it to Myra's forehead, count heartbeats until her own slowed. When Mira dozed again, Selene sat at the small table and stared at the empty place where her mother's ring used to lie. She'd traded memory for medicine and would do it again, 1,000 times, but the space it left behind was a second mouth that needed feeding. A knock came. Not the neighbor's brisk rap nor the landlord's practiced thump, but a measured sound, firm and patient. Selene's hand went automatically to the knife she kept under the pillow. She set it on the table where she could reach it without telegraphing fear. Another knock. She glanced at Mira, sleeping, and crossed to the door. The man on the landing wore the black and steel of the Ebon Guard. Rain had polished the leather of his cloak. The hawk on his pauldron looked ready to fly. He had captain's eyes, the kind that measured rooms while the rest of him pretended to be at ease. "Selene Arkwright," he said. She did not confirm or deny. "The cooper's upstairs," she said, even though he wasn't. "You're at the wrong door." The captain's mouth tilted, not unkindly. "By order of the guardian of Veyr," he said, offering a small iron token stamped with the Citadel seal. "I am to escort you." Ice threaded her spine. She glanced past him down the stairwell. No clatter of boots, no ring of steel, just the distant murmur of the waking street. The token looked heavy, old, honest. Orders were orders, but the guard had come alone. "Escort me where?" she asked. Her voice felt steady. She didn't trust it. "To a conversation." He paused, then added, as if he understood the curve of her thoughts. "Your niece may remain. I have a runner posted at the door below. No one will cross your threshold." Selene looked back into the room. Mira slept with her fist tucked beneath her cheek, lashes like shadows on her skin. The thought of leaving, even for an hour, felt like stepping off a bridge with faith in the depth of the water. But the guardian's warning from the night before still lived in her bones like cold. She wrapped her shawl tighter, took the knife, and slid it into the fold at her hip. "Very well," she said. "A conversation." The captain nodded once. "Thane Rook," he said, as if names were a courtesy he refused to forget. "I'll keep my distance. You'll see why." They went down past the cooper's door and into the yard. A thin sun had found the city and was trying to convince it to be warm again. The runner by the gate, barely more than a boy, stood straighter when he saw Captain Rook and fixed his gaze politely on the opposite wall after taking one quick, curious look at Selene. They hadn't gone far before she sensed him. It was not sound. His steps made no more noise than a cat's, nor scent, for the wind carried only tannery sting and the faint sweetness of baking from streets upriver. It was the way the air changed, like the second before a bell is struck. Kalen Duskbane stood at the end of the lane, half in shadow. He wore no insignia and needed none. In daylight he looked less like a myth and more like a verdict. Hair dark as riverstone, jaw set with a kind of discipline that knew its own cost, eyes a gold that daylight could not diminish. He had removed his gloves but kept his hands folded behind his back, as if he did not trust them near the world. "Captain," he said. "Guardian," Thane returned, stepping aside, and Selene noticed, 3 measured paces away from where she stood. The guardian inclined his head, the precise degree a king might offer a foreign envoy. Then those gold eyes rested on Selene. They were not cruel. They were not kind either. They were attentive in a way that made her feel suddenly like a word under a scholar's finger, an old word he wanted very badly to understand. "You went where you should not," he said. "Yes," Selene answered. She did not drop her gaze. "And I would again." Thane's mouth twitched the smallest bit, as if surprised and resigned at once. Something like a shadow crossed Kalen's face. Annoyance or interest or both. "You dropped a page," he said. "I know. It is not for you. It was for anyone who needed it," she said, the anger surprising her by arriving as calm. "My niece is drowning inside her own lungs. The priests tell me the gods enjoy a challenge. Your books offered a recipe." "My books," he repeated, and the words went soft and dangerous. These are not simple herbs tied up in string. I can read what most cannot. She lifted her chin. That makes me a better thief than a fool, perhaps. But it also makes me useful. Thane's eyes flicked to Kaelin, then away again like a hound waiting for a hand signal. Kaelin studied her for a heartbeat longer than comfort allowed, then spoke without looking at the captain. Clear the lane. Thane gave a short nod and melted back toward the yard. The runner was already gone, as if the suggestion had traveled on the air ahead of the order. Selene became acutely aware of the distance between herself and the Guardian. He seemed to take up space without moving. People passing at the far end of the lane glanced and then looked away quickly, the way all living things do when a storm sits quietly on the horizon. "What do you want from me?" she asked. His jaw clenched, she saw the muscle jump. "If I had wanted to punish you," he said, "you would not be standing in the sun. That is not an answer." He breathed out through his nose, as if remembering how to speak to people who did not take commands as compliments. "You can read the mountain hands." "Yes." Not the tidy script the priests prize. The old lines. The ones carved into bone and weather and stubborn prayer. A memory rose unbidden. The healer's hut high in the pine. Her mother's fingers tracing a mirrored curve over steam. The ache of that recollection softened something in Selene's chest and sharpened something else. "I can," she said. "Then you will work in my archives. You will read what my own men cannot. You will help me interpret the ward strings that hold this city together, and the recipes that may keep it from unraveling." He lifted his chin a fraction. "In exchange, your niece will have what she needs. Medicine, yes, but also protection. If you step inside the Citadel, you will be under my hand." The phrase made something inside her flinch and then bristle. "Under your hand," she said. "How fortunate for me." He went very still. When he replied, the words were measured, sanded smooth. "You misunderstand the shape of my offer," he said. "I am asking Selene Arkwright." "No," she said, and surprised them both, herself most of all, with how soft the word came. "You need me. If you didn't, you would not be here in an alley, speaking to a wolfless exile who lives over a cooper's yard." They stood in a stalemate of air and silence for 3 heartbeats. Then Kaelin did something she had not expected. He stepped back 1 pace like a man making room for a thought. "You touched me," he said quietly. Selene's mouth went dry. The memory of his half-changed face, the claws ripping through glove and air, the sound he'd made, something like grief with fangs, rose around them both like a shape. "It was an accident," she said. "Most disasters are," he answered, and the corner of his mouth almost, not quite, bent toward humor before it steadied. "You touched me," he repeated, "and my body betrayed me in a manner designed by another." She frowned. "Designed? My sister wove shackles into my skin." He said it with the same cadence men use to describe old scars. "For my protection," she said. "In the years after a betrayal that nearly killed me." The ward line's answer to a single condition. Any contact, deliberate or accidental, from a woman sets them alight. Change begins. Sometimes I cage it. Sometimes it cages me. He held her gaze. "It is easier to be thought arrogant than dangerous. It is easier to be alone." The lane shifted around his words. Selene realized with a jolt that every habit she had noticed, the folded hands, the 3 paces Thane kept, the way he stood in shadow at the edge of the lane rather than come to the door, were not affectations of power. They were the routines of a man who had learned exactly where to place his body to keep the world safe from it. "Your sister," she said. "Lady Evandra." He inclined his head once. The name had the weight of history in it. "She is a priestess of the old pattern. She believed fear was a kind of shield. She is not entirely wrong." He looked down at his bare hands, then put them behind his back again, as if he'd forgotten. "It has saved me from assassins. From rumor. from desires that would have made a weaker man less careful, to a conversation. He paused, then added, as if he understood the curve of her thoughts, "Your niece may remain. I have a runner posted at the door below. No one will cross your threshold." Selene looked back into the room. Mira slept with her fist tucked beneath her cheek, lashes like shadows on her skin. The thought of leaving, even for an hour, felt like stepping off a bridge with faith in the depth of the water. But the Guardian's warning from the night before still lived in her bones like cold. She wrapped her shawl tighter, took the knife, and slid it into the fold at her hip. "Very well," she said. "A conversation." The captain nodded once. "Thane Rook," he said, as if names were a courtesy he refused to forget. "I'll keep my distance. You'll see why." They went down past the cooper's door and into the yard. A thin sun had found the city and was trying to convince it to be warm again. The runner by the gate, barely more than a boy, stood straighter when he saw Captain Rook and fixed his gaze politely on the opposite wall after taking one quick, curious look at Selene. They hadn't gone far before she sensed him. It was not sound. His steps made no more noise than a cat's, nor scent, for the wind carried only tannery sting and the faint sweetness of baking from streets upriver. It was the way the air changed, like the second before a bell is struck. Kaelan Duskbane stood at the end of the lane, half in shadow. He wore no insignia and needed none. In daylight he looked less like a myth and more like a verdict. Hair dark as riverstone, jaw set with a kind of discipline that knew its own cost, eyes a gold that daylight could not diminish. He had removed his gloves but kept his hands folded behind his back, as if he did not trust them near the world. "Captain," he said. "Guardian," Thane returned, stepping aside, and Selene noticed, 3 measured paces away from where she stood. The Guardian inclined his head, the precise degree a king might offer a foreign envoy. Then those gold eyes rested on Selene. They were not cruel. They were not kind either. They were attentive in a way that made her feel suddenly like a word under a scholar's finger, an old word he wanted very badly to understand. "You went where you should not," he said. "Yes," Selene answered. She did not drop her gaze. "And I would again." Thane's mouth twitched the smallest bit, as if surprised and resigned at once. Something like a shadow crossed Kaelan's face, annoyance or interest or both. "You dropped a page," he said. "I know. It is not for you. It was for anyone who needed it," she said, the anger surprising her by arriving as calm. "My niece is drowning inside her own lungs. The priests tell me the gods enjoy a challenge. Your books offered a recipe." "My books," he repeated, and the words went soft and dangerous. "These are not simple herbs tied up in string. I can read what most cannot." She lifted her chin. "That makes me a better thief than a fool, perhaps. But it also makes me useful." Thane's eyes flicked to Kaelan, then away again like a hound waiting for a hand signal. Kaelan studied her for a heartbeat longer than comfort allowed, then spoke without looking at the captain. "Clear the lane." Thane gave a short nod and melted back toward the yard. The runner was already gone, as if the suggestion had traveled on the air ahead of the order. Selene became acutely aware of the distance between herself and the Guardian. He seemed to take up space without moving. People passing at the far end of the lane glanced and then looked away quickly, the way all living things do when a storm sits quietly on the horizon. "What do you want from me?" she asked. His jaw clenched, she saw the muscle jump. "If I had wanted to punish you," he said, "you would not be standing in the sun. That is not an answer." He breathed out through his nose, as if remembering how to speak to people who did not take commands as compliments. "You can read the mountain hands." "Yes." Not the tidy script the priests prize. Bold lines. The ones carved into bone and weather and stubborn prayer. A memory rose unbidden. The healer's hut high in the pine, her mother's fingers tracing a mirrored curve over steam. The ache of that recollection softened something in Selene's chest and sharpened something else. "I can," she said. "Then you will work in my archives. You will read what my own men cannot. You will help me interpret the ward strings that hold this city together, and the recipes that may keep it from unraveling." He lifted his chin a fraction. "In exchange, your niece will have what she needs. Medicine, yes, but also protection. If you step inside the Citadel, you will be under my hand." The phrase made something inside her flinch and then bristle. "Under your hand," she said. "How fortunate for me." He went very still. When he replied, the words were measured, sanded smooth. "You misunderstand the shape of my offer," he said. "I am asking Selene Arkwright." "No," she said, and surprised them both, herself most of all, with how soft the word came. "You need me. If you didn't, you would not be here in an alley, speaking to a wolfless exile who lives over a cooper's yard." They stood in a stalemate of air and silence for 3 heartbeats. Then Kaelin did something she had not expected. He stepped back 1 pace like a man making room for a thought. "You touched me," he said quietly. Selene's mouth went dry. The memory of his half-changed face, the claws ripping through glove and air, the sound he'd made, something like grief with fangs, rose around them both like a shape. "It was an accident," she said. "Most disasters are," he answered, and the corner of his mouth almost, not quite, bent toward humor before it steadied. "You touched me," he repeated, "and my body betrayed me in a manner designed by another." She frowned. "Designed? My sister wove shackles into my skin." He said it with the same cadence men use to describe old scars. "For my protection," she said. "In the years after a betrayal that nearly killed me." The ward line's answer to a single condition. Any contact, deliberate or accidental, from a woman sets them alight. Change begins. Sometimes I cage it. Sometimes it cages me. He held her gaze. "It is easier to be thought arrogant than dangerous. It is easier to be alone." The lane shifted around his words. Selene realized with a jolt that every habit she had noticed, the folded hands, the 3 paces Thane kept, the way he stood in shadow at the edge of the lane rather than come to the door, were not affectations of power. They were the routines of a man who had learned exactly where to place his body to keep the world safe from it. "Your sister," she said. "Lady Evandra." He inclined his head once. The name had the weight of history in it. "She is a priestess of the old pattern. She believed fear was a kind of shield. She is not entirely wrong." He looked down at his bare hands, then put them behind his back again, as if he'd forgotten. "It has saved me from assassins, from rumor, from desires that would have made a weaker man less careful." "And imprisoned you," Selene said, before she had time to decide if cruelty was what she meant to offer. "And imprisoned me," he agreed without flinching. "You see then why I do not enter rooms uninvited, why I keep distance even from loyalty, why my scholars are all men, and still I send for you." The ache that had sharpened earlier found new ground. "Your men can't read what needs reading," she murmured. "They can read the polished versions of things. I need someone who can read the parts written by hands that didn't care to be understood by civilized eyes." His gaze flicked past her toward the stair that led up to Mira. As if summoned by the direction of his attention, the cough sounded, muffled by walls and blankets but unmistakable. Selene's body moved before thought, half a turn toward the door, half a prayer. She caught herself, forced her feet to stay where they were. She would not show him how badly she needed what he offered. She would not. Kaelin spoke without looking at her. "Captain." Thane appeared at the mouth of the lane as if the name had called him from the air. "Guardian." In the satchel. Thane unslung a small leather bag, withdrew a stoppered glass vial and a folded parchment. He set both on the top step of the stair, not offering them to Selene, not handing them to the guardian. He moved back 3 paces and waited. "What is it?" Selene asked. "Grey lark syrup," Kaelin said. "Distilled properly. Not the adulterated stuff the apothecaries sell to men who don't know better. It will loosen the cough. And instructions for steam with pine, rosemary, and a pinch of salt. Not much more than a pinch. Too much will draw water where you don't want it." "How?" She didn't finish. "You've had practice," she said instead. "I listen when healers talk," he said. "Especially the ones who do not care if I hear them." Selene's throat tightened. The urge to thank him pressed against her teeth, old and reflexive. She didn't say the word. He had not brought her a miracle, just a relief, but in a life built of small salvations that could be almost as holy. "You will still come," he said, and the iron returned to the shape of his voice. "Tonight after sunset. The East Gate. Captain Rook will meet you. You will work where I say. You will not touch me. You will keep 3 paces when we share a room. You will speak truth even if it bites. And in return—" He regarded her as if weighing old coin. "In return," he said, "you will have what is needed to keep the little one breathing. And you will have the chance to be the thing your clan decided you were not. Necessary." She wanted to bristle. She wanted to let the word Wolfless hit her like a thrown stone and hit back. Instead she found herself standing in the small quiet place where fury and relief overlap and make something dangerously like hope. "Your sister won't like it," she said. "No," he agreed. "She likes very little that I do. She believes the only way to save a city is to freeze it in place and make it too hard to break. I believe the only way is to let it change where it must. We share blood. We do not share conclusions." Selene moved toward the stair. "I'll give the syrup now," she said, more to herself than him. She paused on the bottom step. "And tonight." "Tonight," he said. "Bring what you can carry. Leave what you are willing to lose." She looked back over her shoulder. "Is that a warning?" "It is experience dressed as advice." He turned to go, then hesitated. And in that small pause the grandeur of the guardian slipped and she saw a man. Not a myth, not a verdict. Just a tired, disciplined man who had measured out his life in distances and half-changes. "Selene," he said. "Yes. I am not in the habit of asking." The corners of his mouth shifted, not into a smile. It felt like a thing he had forgotten how to do, but into an acknowledgement of a shared, uncomfortable truth. "Do not make me regret learning." She did not promise. She did not refuse. She nodded once, sharply, and carried the vial up the stairs as if it were something that could answer a prayer. The syrup worked quickly. Myra's breath eased. The cough became something the body could manage rather than something that managed the body. Selene mixed steam as instructed, ignoring the part of her that wanted to resent the accuracy of the guardian's recipe simply because it was his. By afternoon the fever had settled to a stubborn glow. Mira woke, limp but smiling, and asked for the story of the fox and the moon again. Selene told it softly, letting the ending catch in her own throat. When the girl slept, she packed. She had never been to the Citadel except in the way all poor people are, by looking up. She had no idea what the inside of a fortress did to a person's sense of self. She took what she thought would anchor her. The shawl she had woven from scraps, the little wooden comb her mother had used and mended and used again, the coil of rope, a handful of candles, the book she had borrowed and intended to return the same night. She hesitated over the knife and then slid it into her satchel anyway. A woman could be many things and still be wise. Captain Rook arrived just after sunset as promised. The runner from that morning was with him, now carrying a lantern that painted the alley gold. Thane's gaze slid past Selene into the room and caught on Myra's sleeping shape. He nodded once, reassuringly, though no words passed his mouth. "Ready?" he asked. "No," Selene said and stepped into the night, securing the latch. "Yes." They walked upriver. The streets narrowed and then widened. Laundry lines became banners. The stone grew darker and more sure of itself. The Citadel's eastern gate rose from the street like a cliff that had learned symmetry. Torches bracketed the arch, but their flames made no dent in the sense of shadow collected there. "Keep to my left," Thane murmured without looking at her. 3 paces between you and the guardian if he's in the hall. 2 between you and any stray priest. Priests. She kept her voice low. "They believe all rooms are theirs until told otherwise," he said, and there was something like humor beneath the caution. "You'll know Lady Evandra if you see her. The air changes when she's near. Like the second before a storm." "I thought that was the guardian," Selene said. "For the guardian it is the second before a bell," Thane said. "For his sister, it's the second before a blade." The gate yawned open at their approach, not by magic but by the work of men who had timed their pulls on iron winches to appear as if it were. Inside, the citadel was all angles and echo. Steps had been measured a fraction higher than comfortable. Doorways were slightly narrower than a friend would make them. It made visitors walk with their shoulders tucked, their breath a little shallower. Selene told her lungs to be stubborn. They took a corridor lit by lamps whose wicks were trimmed so neat it felt like a rebuke. The quiet here was curated, not natural. It told you what it wanted to be and expected you to echo it. Thane led her down and then farther down, until the stone began to taste like the tunnels had. Damp, old, sincere. "The Scriptorium Below," she said before she could stop herself. Thane's mouth curved. "There are doors you can't come through from the outside," he said. "And doors you can't come through from the inside. It is an old scholar's joke that the best libraries are mostly stairs." He stopped at a heavy door barred with iron that had been polished by hands. He knocked once. The bar lifted. The door opened. Kaelin waited inside. He had changed. No cloak now, only black and steel and gloves again, which he flexed once as if to remind his hands where not to be. A low table held a stack of wrapped books and a tray with a teapot casting steam like a subtle spell. The room smelled faintly of oil and old paper, and something that might have been pine if pine could learn to be disciplined. Selene stopped just inside the threshold. 3 paces. She let the distance be a courtesy instead of a rule, if only for herself. "Arkwright," Kaelin said, and made her name sound like a roll, not a failure. "Come." She did. They circled the table like careful planets, each keeping to their orbit. Kaelin unwrapped the top book with the care of a surgeon. The script inside was dense, nervous, unwilling to be understood. "This," he said, tapping a margin where the ink had faded to the color of old tea, "is the ward grammar for the East Wall. It was written by a man who distrusted his own students and hid his notes inside insults. Can puzzle some of it. The rest wants a mountain tongue." Selene leaned over the page, letting the letters climb into her head and make their strange, familiar nests. It came back like a song she hadn't known she still knew. The mirrored curves, the straight-spined glyphs that only made sense when you read them in the corner of your eye. The way the old hands disguised warnings as recipes and recipes as prayers. "This line," she said, pointing without touching the page, "isn't an insult. It's a subtraction. Remove the second thread whenever the river floods higher than the third step. If you don't, the ward pulls water into the stone." Kaelin's eyes sharpened. "We've had seepage at the east wall after storms. No matter how often we repoint the mortar, it returns. The men blamed the river. The priests blamed the men. The script blames whoever didn't read it properly," Selene said, surprising herself with the ease of the answer. Kaelin's mouth did that almost smile again. "Good," he said simply, and there was satisfaction in the word and relief. They worked. Lamps burned lower. It cooled. Words that had not been spoken aloud in years were coaxed into the air and given back their purposes. Sometimes Kaelin asked a question with a scholar's patience. Sometimes Selene answered with a healer's certainty. They learned how the other's mind turned, where it caught and where it leapt. At one point their hands, hers reaching for a paperweight, his for the same, hesitated over the same inch of air. They both froze. The curse did not snarl because their skin did not meet. They stepped back in the same heartbeat, then went on as if nothing had strained to happen. At last, when the lamps had sank to blue-edged wicks and the words had begun to double in her eyes, Selene swayed on her feet. Kaelin noticed. He sees too much, she thought, not for the first time, and was too tired to resent it. Enough for tonight, he said, and the command sounded like kindness forced to wear armor. Captain will see you home. Home. The thought of Mira alone tugged hard at the thread in her chest that connected them, and relief followed the tug so quickly it made her dizzy. For tonight, Kaelin said. Tomorrow we'll move you to quarters inside the Citadel. There is no sense in making a woman with a sick child walk so far after midnight. She should have refused on principle. Pride is a fine pillow until you try to sleep on it. She nodded instead. Thank you. He tilted his head. You said the word, he murmured. It didn't burn. Don't get used to it, she said, and saw something like a laugh catch in his throat and wait there, uncertain. At the door she paused. You asked me to speak truth even if it bites. I did. Then here is mine, she said, felt her heart choose the words and her mouth obey. You carry your chains with discipline. But you are still chained. She swallowed. I don't know if I can help you break them. I don't know if I want to. But I can read what needs reading, and I will not let a child drown if letters can teach the air to turn into breath. He held her gaze for a long moment. That is more truth than most men bring me in a year, he said. We'll begin again tomorrow. She stepped into the corridor. Thane lifted the lantern. Kaelin's voice followed her as softly as an oath. Keep the syrup by the bed, he said. 2 drops if the cough returns before dawn. 3 if her breath pulls at the spaces between her ribs. She nodded without looking back. The lamps hissed. The corridor turned her footsteps into someone else's and returned them. At the gate, the night tasted like rain that might come again if invited. On the walk home, Thane said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, it was without ceremony. You're not afraid of him, he observed. I am, she said. But I am also not. She frowned at her own confession. There's a difference between fearing a beast and recognizing a cage. Thane's mouth tilted that same private curve. If you can see the cage, he said, you are already closer to the key. He lifted the lantern a fraction. Mind the step. They reached the yard. Selene climbed the stairs and let herself into the room. Mira slept, mouth open just enough to let a thin snore escape now and then like a bird startled in a dream. Selene stood in the doorway a long time, feeling like a traveler who has finally found the right road, even if it runs through a valley where shadows gather. She set the vial on the table. She unlaced her boots and left them where she could find them fast. She looked at her hands, ink-stained, rope-burned, useful, and told them softly that they would not touch the guardian. They would touch pages and kettles and Myra's hair and the iron ring that opened walls. And if one day they touched something else with gentleness, she would let that day decide its own name. In the Citadel, in a room lined with books that had learned how to keep secrets, Kaelin Duskbane sat with his gloves on and his hands still. He listened to the way the lamplight hummed against the glass and to the memory of a wolfless woman's voice, patient and steady, translating an old insult into the subtraction that would keep a wall from drinking a river. When he finally rose, his chair scraped the stone with a sound like resolve. He blew out the last lamp and stood in the dark until his eyes remembered the difference between shadow and danger. 3 paces, he told the dark, an old rule spoken like prayer. And then quieter. Truth even if it bites. Chapter 4, A Bargain of Necessity. They came at first light, the Citadel's color still dull with dew. Captain Thane Rook, a quiet runner with a lantern he did not need, and a cart whose wheels had the decency to creak softly in the cooper's yard. Selene had not slept much. She had spent the hours between midnight and dawn packing a life that could be lifted in 2 trips and braiding courage into her shawl fringe so her fingers would remember to be brave when her mind forgot. Mira woke to the sound of gentle voices and the smell of bread and broth. The runner, no more than 16, with a face that had not yet learned how to hide, set a covered bowl on the table and then looked anywhere but at the unmade bed. "From the kitchens," he murmured, as if kitchens were a secret he could share. "Guardian's order." Selene touched Myra's brow. The fever was softer now, more a stubborn blush than a blaze. "We're going to a big house," she told the child softly. "It has too many stairs and not enough rugs." Mira blinked. "Will there be windows?" "More than anyone needs." "Will there be wolves?" The question came small and matter-of-fact, a leftover from 100 bedtime stories that had taught her to look for teeth in shadows, but also to count the stars and keep track of the moon. Selene thought of gold eyes burning in the scriptorium, of claws punching cleanly through leather. She thought of a man who stood 3 measured paces from the world and called it safety. "Only the kind that keep watch," she said. "Eat while it's warm." They folded their lives into a satchel and a rope-tied bundle. The shawl Selene had woven from scraps became a sling for Mira when the child tired. Thane helped with the rest. Careful hands, deliberate distance. On the cart, between bundles that smelled of resin and old grain, Mira sat upright like a small captain and accepted a wood-carved dog from the runner as if receiving a treaty. The city changed as they rode. The stone grew darker, more sure of itself. The streets widened and then narrowed to prove a point about who had the right to pass. By the time they reached the eastern gate, torches had traded their night faces for day, and the obsidian spires of the Citadel stood like a handful of knives flung into the sky and stuck there because gravity had been told to behave. Inside, echo gathered like an anxious flock. Everything was designed to be a little too large for comfort. Ceilings that made you walk taller without noticing, doorways that turned strangers into supplicants by shaving a breath off their stride. Myra's hand slid into Selene's shawl fringe and stayed there, knotted in a loop of blue. "Keep to my left," Thane said. His voice lowered out of respect for the echo. "There are places where the floor remembers the weight of a charge and acts like it means to begin one." Servants moved like well-aimed arrows. Guards watched in pairs. The Citadel had learned that the worst trouble wore a familiar face and announced itself only in retrospect. They watched Selene with the curiosity people reserve for accidents they themselves did not cause. "Is that her?" one murmured as they passed, too close to keep the whisper from carrying. "The wolfless exile under the Guardian's hand." 3 paces, his partner warned, and the warning held something like respect rather than scorn. Still, the phrase hung in the air. Wolfless exile, a label stitched to the back of a dress she had not chosen, easy to read at a distance. Selene kept her chin level and her eyes where they were needed. Pride could be a blade. She would not draw it here unless someone's life required cutting. Their quarters lay along a narrow turning that smelled faintly of beeswax and river-cooled stone. Thane opened the door and stepped aside, pointedly leaving the threshold to her. The room was larger than their old one by a bed, smaller by 3 memories. A low trundle would slide beneath the main bed when Mira woke. There was a basin, a brazier, a shelf where the shawl's shadow could live when it needed to dry. "The hearth shares a chimney with the kitchens," Thane said, gesturing to the thin warmth in the wall. "It remembers to be kind even when the wind forgets. Call for water if the fever rises." Mira wandered the perimeter with the solemnity of a child inspecting a new nest. She tapped the wall as if listening for an echo of the last people who had slept here and seemed to approve of their silence. Thane's gaze touched the band of worn blue at Selene's shoulder, the place where the sling cut a diagonal across her ribs. "The Guardian will see you afternoon," he said. "The archives breathe easiest then." The priests tend to their midday chants. The hall's empty. Fewer accidents. Selene knew what he meant and did not need it explained. I'm not in the habit of tripping men into becoming monsters, she said lightly. I didn't say you were in the habit, Thane replied. Only that it takes less than a habit to make trouble, and less than intention to start a fire that will not listen. Then, as if he had remembered a small mercy he could afford, he added, There is a window. There was, high and square, with a view of nothing but sky. For a moment, Selene let the blue pour onto her face like water, and did not mind that it looked back at her without judgment. The archives lived inside the Citadel like a second set of bones. Selene followed Thane through rooms that had taught 1,000 men how to speak softly and one man how to hold silence like a shield. The Scriptorium Below had been damp and secret. This place was the same animal with its fur brushed and its claws sheathed on the surface. A thin layer of oil kept the lamps from smoking. It could not keep old ink from smelling like little funerals. Kalen Duskbane stood at the far table, the posture of his body suggesting someone who had spent too long training himself not to reach. He wore gloves again, the lambskin dark enough to pass for an apology. At the sound of their arrival he looked up, and for an instant the 3 paces of air between them felt like a geography lesson. Distance, elevation, fault line. Arkwright, he said, in that precise tone that made a name into a function rather than a wound. Captain. Guardian. Thane's nod was clean and exact. He drifted backward, settled into watch without settling into presence. Selene set her satchel on the table and removed the book she had promised to return. Kalen's eyes flicked to it, quick, pleased, as if he had not entirely trusted her promise but was choosing to trust her action. He gestured to the spread of papers before him. Ward strings for the north wall, he said. The masons insist the mortar fails from age. The priests insist the river is sulking. I suspect a subtraction written by someone who forgot that the world changes height when it snows. She stepped closer, reading at a slant. Here. She pointed at a marginal glyph without touching the page. This mark is an instruction to steal strength from a neighboring brace during cold snaps. Steal. His mouth curved. Not approval, not mockery. Interest, kept on a short leash. Borrow, she conceded. The old hands liked ugly words for honest work. They believed fear made a better teacher than reason. On this, he said, we agree. She told him which threads to loosen and where to knot them when the thaw came. He listened like a soldier who had learned that the enemy is often the explanation you didn't want to hear. When she finished, he poured tea and set a cup on the table between them without sliding it toward her, an offering placed inside the neutral ground of the 3 paces. Selene took 3 steps around the table instead and picked it up. A corner of his mouth twitched as if surprised into acknowledging that solutions came in shapes etiquette did not anticipate. They worked through 2 more stacks of vellum, their exchanges sharp and accurate. He corrected her once, gently but without patting. Her reading of a mountain curl too academic for the gritty way the old carvers had meant it. She corrected him twice, returning his bluntness with her own. It felt less like combat and more like carpentry. Measure, mark, cut, test the seam with your thumb to see if light leaks through. At some point a sound threaded into the room that did not belong to paper. The high, unself-conscious laughter of a child rolling like marbles down a corridor. Selene paused, head tilting toward the door before she could stop herself. Kalen's eyes lifted too, fast as a clock spring snapping. He did not move, but the air around him did. Some tension in his neck easing in increments that did not belong to conscious muscles. Mira, Selene said, and could hear the pride she had not meant to let out into a hallway that knew how to report on everything. The runner must have shown her the window seats. Kalen studied the doorway as if considering whether to embrace the sound or forbid it. The Citadel is not designed for laughter, he said finally. Not designed for it, Selene allowed. But not immune. A shadow crossed the threshold, Thane, leaning in just enough to gauge the guardian's expression without presuming. He flicked 2 fingers. All well. Kaelin gave the barest nod. The captain ghosted away, leaving only a whisper of leather behind. Your men whisper, Selene said to the papers, not to him. Everyone does. I know what they call me. Kaelin did not pretend confusion. Men who whisper say more out loud than they intend, he replied. I do not measure people by the names they survived. Only by the ones they earn. Wolfless exile is not a name I earned, she said, and now she did look at him, because some truths preferred a face to fall on. No, he said, meeting her gaze and holding it as if the act cost him less now than yesterday. It is one you carry with skill you did not ask to learn. Silence sat with them a moment and did not feel unfriendly. A knock at the inner door broke it. A steward stepped in, gray-haired and iron-spined, with the soft authority of a man who had nursed princes and reprimanded kings. Guardian, he said, bowing just enough to keep protocol from bruising itself. Lady Evandra sends word that the noon supplication will run long. The eastern cloister is to be avoided. Selene felt the temperature of the room shift. Kaelin's hand stayed flat on the table, but the leather of his gloves creaked, a whisper of strain. We are in the west, he said. We will avoid it anyway. The steward's eyes found Selene, measured her quickly and without malice, as if counting rivets on a bridge. Ma'am, he said, then withdrew. Your sister disapproves, Selene said, not a question. Of most things, Kaelin agreed. Of this in particular. He reached for the top sheet in the next stack and stopped, fingers above the page like a hawk that has decided not to stoop. I will not ask you to ignore her. I will ask you not to let her fear choose your distance. You ask a great deal, Selene said. I always have, he answered, and there was no pride in it. They returned to the work until the lamp's glass chimed softly in a draught Selene could not feel. When the hour grew thin, Kaelin closed the last ledger with a satisfaction that he let show only in the evenness of his breath. Come, he said, surprising her. There is something you will need to see if we are to be efficient. He led her down a narrower corridor. His stride shortened a fraction to account for the length of hers. Not courtesy, not arrogance, simply a calculation that admitted the existence of other bodies moving through the world. The door they stopped at was not grand. It had the scarred look of wood that has been relied upon more than admired. This is where I misbehave, he said dryly, and pushed it open with his shoulder so his hands could stay safely behind his back. Kaelin's study was nothing like the council chambers with their civic showpiece confidence. It was a room made out of trying, maps pinned over other maps until borders had grown fat from being drawn and redrawn, shelves of notebooks whose spines bore no titles, only numbers and dates, a work table scratched with experiments, grooves dug by metal that had been too sharp, ink stains shaped like countries that never existed. A window cut high in the wall admitted a clean stripe of light that made the rest of the room seem to hold its breath. On the central table lay a scatter of sketches. Not battle plans. Not walls. Bodies. His own, she realized with a start, rendered in charcoal with an anatomist's patience and a guilty man's speed. Muscles overlaid with sigils, bones circled where runes might take purchase, lines of script in 2 hands, one tight and disciplined, the other hurried, almost angry. Between them sat a small box, open to reveal a pair of gloves with the fingers torn raggedly at the tips, as if someone had decided halfway through a transformation to trust his hands and then learned better. Selene stepped to the table's edge and did not touch. The sketches were not the work of a man in love with his own suffering. They were the work of someone who had mapped his prison so thoroughly he could walk it in the dark without cracking a toe, and was still looking for a door. This, Kaelin said, gesturing with his chin the way men do when their hands cannot be trusted, is what I am when no one else is allowed to look. Do you still want the work? She thought of the guards who had said Wolfless exile like a convenience. She thought of Mira laughing in a corridor that had not been designed for laughter and Thane's two-finger signal that meant all is well unless I hesitate at the end. She thought of Kalen cataloging his curse until it could not surprise him enough to kill someone else. The work is the reason I am here, she said quietly. Your curse is the reason you are asking. He did not flinch at the bluntness. I have tried to break it, he said, pointing with his words to the notebooks stacked like small tombstones. I have tried to tame it. I have tried to starve it by refusing the world the kind of intimacy that would feed it. My sister believes that is wisdom. I have begun to suspect it is simply a slow death with good manners. What did you try here? She nodded at a page where a mirrored sigil had been drawn and struck through, then drawn again with a tiny alteration. A line turned half a degree, a curve thickened as if to keep it from slipping. Anchors, he said. Points to hold the change in the joints until the storm passes. It works when a man I trust grips my forearm. It does not hold when a woman's touch lights the match. And if the woman is trusted? The question came before she could shepherd it safely back behind her teeth. He looked at her then, sharply, and something hot and warning rolled through the gold of his gaze. Not anger. Not desire. Recognition of a cliff's edge. Trust is not the measure the curse uses, he said. It is too crude for that. It recognizes only absence and presence. Skin, pressure, heat. It consumes nuance like sugar. Selene leaned in a fraction. Your sketches suggest you don't believe that entirely. My sketches, he said, suggest a man who hopes, which is often the same as a fool who refuses to quit. A small noise sounded at the door. Knuckles, then silence, a child's understanding of another person's sovereignty. Mira stood there, wood-carved dog held in both hands like a pilgrim's offering. Behind her hovered the runner, eyes wide, posture mortified at having lost track of his charge for the space of a blink. I'm sorry, the boy blurted. It is a hallway, Kalen said mildly. It is meant to be shared. Mira looked between them, solemn and brave, then made her way to Selene and pressed her face into the shawl. The window seats are soft, she reported into wool. And the lady with the ribbon hat says you are important, which I already knew. Selene smoothed the child's hair. The lady with the ribbon hat has good eyes. Kalen did not step closer, but the room felt as if he did. He crouched instead, 3 paces from Mira, 1 pace from the work table, every muscle careful, and let his voice drop to the tone one uses when approaching a skittish animal or a fragile truth. Mira, he said, tasting the name for the first time. Would you like a better window? Mira peered around the shawl. Better than the sky. A different sky, he amended. Lower. With pigeons who think they are kings. She considered this with the seriousness of a general allocating troops. Yes. Thane will show you the rookery, he said, standing again. No touching feathers. Tell them with your eyes that they are fine birds and then leave them to agree. Mira nodded decisively, took the runner's hand. His face brightening as if someone had handed him an unscheduled honor, and allowed herself to be escorted away. When the doorway had emptied, Kalen's glance returned to the sketches. He did not apologize for them. He did not try to hide them. There are things you will see here, he said, that my sister would prefer remained secrets. If they threaten the city, you may tell Thane. If they threaten only my pride, you may tell no one. I wasn't planning to tell anyone your pride was human, Selene said, and earned the barest breath that could one day learn to be a laugh. They returned to the archives until the lamps argued for rest. Outside, the Citadel learned dusk the way it learned everything, by insisting that even the end of daylight follow a procedure. In the corridor, 2 young guards stared too directly at Selene until Thane appeared behind them without sound and gave them a look that was not unkind and not optional. They found urgent business in the opposite direction. As Thane walked Selene back to her room, the Citadel felt a fraction less hostile. Myra's laughter had left a warmth in the stone that made even the echoes sit differently, as if the halls had remembered an old trick. At her door, Thane paused. "The men who whisper," he said, "have short memories for orders and long memories for gossip. If any speak the words again where you can hear them, Wolfless exile. Tell me who. It is not a crime to be cruel here. It is simply a thing I dislike, which tends to have similar consequences." "I'll manage," Selene said, but the offer touched a place she did not show to strangers, and the truth of that must have been visible because Thane inclined his head as if she had said thank you. Inside, Mira was already asleep, the wood-carved dog tucked under her arm, a faint smudge of soot making a star on her cheek. Selene washed it away with a wet finger and then sat in the window's blue, letting the day settle bone by bone. She thought of the sketches, of desperation rendered in careful lines, of a man's loneliness drawn to scale. She thought of the way Kaelin had said "my sister" and made the word sound like a well-built barricade that had begun to block the wrong door. She drew out a scrap of paper and a stub of charcoal and wrote a single note to leave on his table tomorrow, because there were truths that did not fit in voiced sentences and had to be carried by ink. If the curse's measure is rough, make the anchor's measure exact. Balance brutality with precision. You have been brutal to yourself for so long that precision will feel like mercy. She blew on the ink until it dried, then folded the paper and put it under the teacup to weigh it down, a promise of intention pressed by something ordinary. Sleep came cautiously, as if the bed were a ship and the room a sea. Just before she sank, Selene heard a sound beyond the door. A step, then nothing. She did not open her eyes. She knew the rhythm already. Thane making his final pass, the runner tripping behind him, and farther away, a quieter tread that acknowledged her presence without trespass. The guardian did not stand watch. He had a fortress for that. But sometimes, perhaps, even a fortress learned the small habit of pausing outside a door where laughter had recently been and remembering how it sounded. In the study, Kaelin sat with a glove off and traced, with his forefinger, the line of a sigil on the page, the half-degree that turned hope from a hazard into a hinge. He did not touch the edge of the table where claw marks notched the wood. He did not need to. They were the map of where he had been. The sketches were the map of where he meant to go. 3 paces. Bargain. Necessity. And uninvited but not unwelcome, the echo of a child's laugh living rent-free in a citadel of silence, making even the stone hold its breath in a gentler way. Chapter 5. The Fortress of Silent Watchers. The citadel was a fortress built not only of obsidian and mortar, but of eyes. Selene noticed it quickly. Every corridor, every stairwell, every balcony had its watchers. They did not call themselves spies. They called themselves the Ebon Guard, men sworn to Kaelin Duskbane with a loyalty sharpened by fear as much as duty. She had seen them on her first day, black-cloaked figures who patrolled like shadows that had learned to breathe. Their armor was practical, matte black that caught no glint of torchlight, and their faces seemed carved from the same stone as the fortress walls. But their eyes betrayed them. Some carried the weary respect of men who had followed their master into 100 battles. Others held unease, even dread, the kind born not from outside enemies, but from the knowledge that the greatest danger sometimes lived behind the doors they guarded. More than once Selene caught whispers slip like smoke between them when she passed. The Exile, the Wolfless one, the Guardian's experiment. But more often, the whispers were about Kaelin himself. "He keeps the beasts at bay," one soldier muttered in the mess hall, unaware Selene was near. "He is the beast," his companion hissed, eyes darting to the ceiling. "Speak softer, walls repeat things here." The fortress itself seemed to agree. Its halls carried voices too far, as though the stones had memorized everything spoken in them and refused to let go. At night, when Selene walked Mira through the corridors, she sometimes heard faint clinks of armor where no one should be, or caught the glimmer of gold eyes in a passage above. Always watching, always measuring. Mira, for all her fragility, seemed immune to the fortress's weight. She found secret joys in its hidden corners. Window seats where the glass rattled like teeth when the wind blew, echoing stairwells that doubled her laughter, and kitchens where the cooks smuggled her honeyed biscuits when they thought no officer was watching. But joy did not cure fever. One night, the air turned bitterly cold, the kind of chill that crept under door frames and curled into lungs like smoke. Selene had wrapped Mira in every scrap of cloth they owned, her shawl layered over 2 thin blankets, but still the child's breath grew shallow and her small body trembled. Her cheeks were too red, her skin damp with the sheen of illness. Selene pressed a hand to her forehead and felt the heat spike like a brand. Panic clawed up her throat. Medicine cost coin she no longer had. The city apothecaries were leagues away, and even if she had been allowed to leave at midnight, Mira had no strength for the journey. "Mira, stay with me," Selene whispered, rocking her gently. The child's eyes fluttered, caught between dreams and fever hallucinations. "Stay, little star. Please." A sound stirred in the hall. Measured, heavy, unmistakable. Selene's heart jolted. She turned as the door opened without knock. Kaelan Duskbane stood framed in torchlight, a figure made of night and command. His black cloak swayed behind him, and his golden eyes swept the room in a glance that took in everything: the makeshift bed, Selene's desperation, Myra's pale, shivering form. "You should have summoned a healer," he said, his tone even, though his jaw tightened at the sight. I didn't know if your people would answer me," Selene admitted, clutching Mira closer. "I've asked for help before in this city. Help costs coin. Or worse." For a long moment Kaelan said nothing. Then he stepped forward, pulling off his gloves 1 finger at a time. Selene froze, startled. His hands, always hidden, were bare now. Pale scars webbed the backs of them, thin lines like lightning burns. He crouched beside the bed. "Let me." Selene's instinct screamed no. She remembered his half-shift, the monstrous claws tearing leather, but something in his voice held no command, only quiet insistence. Trembling, she loosened her hold, letting him rest his palm lightly against Myra's temple. For an instant nothing happened. Then Kaelan inhaled sharply, as though drawing sickness into himself. His eyes flickered, gold catching fire, but he did not transform. His touch was steady, precise, almost reverent. Myra's breathing eased. The fever's flame, while not extinguished, dulled to a warm glow instead of a consuming blaze. Selene blinked back sudden tears, relief breaking her composure. "How?" she whispered. Kaelan did not look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the child. "I learned something in my years of restraint. The curse reacts to touch born of desire or threat. A child's need is neither. Does not awaken the beast. It silences it." His voice had softened, almost fragile, as though he were confessing something he rarely dared speak. And then, so quiet Selene thought at first she imagined it, Kaelan began to hum. A tune, low and haunting, rolled from his chest. Words followed in a tongue older than the city walls, a lullaby worn thin by memory but still whole enough to cradle a child's dreams. The melody was gentle, meant for firesides and safe arms, not for a fortress bristling with soldiers and shadows. Selene's breath caught. This was not the voice of the guardian, the feared beast-keeper. This was the voice of a man who once had a family, who once had someone to sing him to sleep when nightmares prowled. Mira stirred, her lips curving faintly. "That song," she mumbled, half dreaming. "It sounds like home." Kaelan stopped, startled, as if the word home had not been spoken to him in years. For a heartbeat, silence pooled thick in the room. Then he rose, replacing his gloves quickly, the mask of command settling back over his features. "You'll keep her warm," he instructed. His voice again clipped, businesslike. "The fever will pass by morning." "Wait," Selene said, her voice unsteady. "What was that song?" He paused at the door, shadows cutting across his profile. "A memory," he said at last. "One no one was meant to hear again." And then he was gone, the echo of his lullaby lingering in the cold room like a fragile ember refusing to die. Selene sat in the silence, holding Mira close, her heart pounding with more than fear. For the first time she had seen not the guardian of the Citadel, not the cursed beast, but Kaelin the man. And that glimpse was more dangerous than any curse. Chapter 6. Sparks in the dark. Night pressed its face to the Citadel's windows and breathed mist onto the glass. In the West Archives, lamps were trimmed to thin blue flames and a single candle burned between Selene and Kaelin, its light painting a bright coin on the table and turning everything beyond it into a country of shadows. They had been at the ward strings for hours, unwinding a snarl hidden in the northern buttresses, teasing sense from notes a long-dead engineer had disguised as insults. The work demanded patience, the kind that doesn't look like heroism because it happens while the city sleeps and no one is watching. Selene didn't mind that kind. It kept her hands busy and her mind from counting the breaths between Myra's coughs. "Strength," Kaelin said at last, breaking a long quiet, "is often a matter of subtraction. Remove what compromises the structure. Take away the point of failure." Selene glanced up from the vellum. His profile was all planes and control. The candle shivered along his cheekbone. "Then you'll have a very strong ruin," she said. "Nothing to fail and nothing to live in." His eyes flicked to her, gold-catching. "You would rather build a warm collapse. I would rather build something that stands because it is balanced, not because it has nothing left to risk," she said, tapping a marginal glyph. "See this?" The old mason left a hollow behind the keystone on purpose, to allow shift, to give the arch room to breathe when the heat swells the stone. "The priests called that a flaw," Kaelin murmured. "The priests like their towers like they like their prayers, stiff and dangerous when they fall." A corner of his mouth lifted and settled again. He stretched his shoulders as if the armor of habit had grown tight. "You think me a tower. I think you hide behind one," she said, the truth leaping before she could domesticate it. "Behind your curse, specifically. As if it were a wall you can't be blamed for building." Silence pooled. It wasn't a hostile silence. It was the kind that grows after a struck bell, when both people wait for the last note to choose a side. Kaelin's gloved fingers curled once, then flattened on the table. "I do not hide," he said evenly. "I watch. Because people live in the city below and their lives are not a philosophy. And because if you stand close enough to anyone," Selene said softer, "the curse answers like a dog that only ever learned to bite." The candle crackled. The lamp chimed as a thread of draft found it. Kaelin stared at his hands as if they belonged to someone whose choices he did not entirely admire. "You think restraint is a mask for fear." "I think." Selene checked herself, rubbed her thumb against the grain of the table to sand down what she might regret. The wood was scored with old claw marks, polished by years. "I think you have mistaken numbness for discipline. And you call it sacrifice because sacrifice sounds holy when what it really is, sometimes, is simply the most respectable way to starve." His head came up at that, sharply like a wolf catching a scent he cannot ignore. Heat moved through the gold of his gaze. "And you," he said, too quiet to be called anger, "speak of sacrifice as if you have tasted it because you have given up coin and jewelry and sleep. You have no idea what it is to lay down your life every day without dying. To make a prison out of your own skin so that no one else bleeds for the luxury of your ease." The words were precise and clean-edged. They found their marks. Selene felt them land and stay. She thought of the roar that had shaken dust from the Scriptorium's rafters the night she touched him. She thought of the way he stood, always, with his hands behind his back and his body arranged around the world so that it could touch him less. She thought of the lullaby. "You're right," she said after a moment, "because truth deserved the work of being spoken. I don't know how it feels to be a weapon someone else forged in the shape of a man. But I know the other side. I know what it is to be told you are nothing and then to make something anyway. And to refuse the word nothing until it stops sticking. His gaze changed, not softened exactly. Calibrated. You argue like a locksmith, he said. As if every door deserves a key. As if every lock betrays what it's meant to protect, she countered, then winced. That was more clever than kind. I didn't mean it to be cruel. Kaelin exhaled. Some of the heat left the air, leaving conviction behind. And I did not mean to diminish your losses. The city gives the kind of cuts that don't bleed until you're alone. They stood on that small bridge for a breath. Two stubborn people admitting the shape of each other's hurts without pretending that admission solved them. Strength, he said at last, is also knowing what you will not do. And weakness, she returned, is letting what you will not do become who you are. For the first time tonight, a sound that could one day learn to be a laugh escaped him. Barely there but real. You have a talent for saying the exact thing that will put splinters into my sleep. It's a village talent, Selene said, unable to help the answering curve of her mouth. Wives used it to get husbands to fix doors. An effective art. He gestured at the vellum. Show me again where the old mason left the archroom to breathe. She did, tracing the mirrored line with a forefinger held a hair above the page. Here. Here. He could have locked it. He chose not to. Kaelin nodded. Then we copy his choice along the east wall when winter comes. A city that does not adapt becomes an altar to its own pride. Selene blinked. We, she echoed. He pretended not to have heard it and reached for the next bundle. They worked until the candle stub was a puddle haloing a wick. Words narrowed to function. Now and then their hands reached toward the same paperweight and hovered, each remembering the rules that kept disaster at bay. 3 paces when we share a room. Do not touch me. Speak truth even if it bites. The bite returned when the discussion turned to the outer wards that braided the lower market. We could shift the anchor from the river gate to the granary, Selene suggested. It would take pressure off the pillars. The market floods first when the river sulks. The granary is closer to the cloister, Kaelin said. Evandra will argue that the wards serve faith before bread. Selene let out a short, tired breath. And you will let her opinion sit where it can be heard above all others. His jaw went hard. I do not let her anything, he said, and there it was again, the cliff's edge. I calculate what she will do that I cannot easily stop without setting a different trap I don't have time to survive. Then I build the city around that. Which is another way to say you live in her design, Selene pressed, gentler now because the first arrow had flown true. And call it yours because you set out the furniture. The gold flared and banked. You accuse me of cowardice. I accuse you of choosing the smallest battlefield because you have learned to win there, she said. And because losing elsewhere would cost too much of you. It would have become a cold thing then, the argument, sharp, efficient, dangerous to touch, if not for the soft scuff at the threshold and the triumphant whisper of a too small voice. I was quiet, like a cat. Cats are allowed anywhere. Selene turned. Mira stood in the doorway, hair sleep-wild, blanket trailing like a cloak. Her cheeks were flushed with the heat that follows fever like a shadow remembering how to be a friend. The runner hovered 3 steps behind, mortified into statuehood. Thane's shadow was a slice of patience farther back, tolerating this midnight invasion because he had already calculated the way it would end. Mischief, Selene said, half scold, whole smile. What did we say about night adventures? That they are more fun with witnesses, Mira answered, with the ferocious sincerity of the recently convalescent. She padded in on bare feet, stopped at the edge of the table's island of light, and peered at the tangle of vellum with solemn interest. Are these spells? Worse, Kaelin said gravely. Instructions. Mira giggled. The sound bounced off stone and came back braver than it had been when it left her. "Bed," Selene said, softening each letter with affection. "Now, one story," Mira bargained, lifting one finger like a merchant naming a price he hoped would be mistaken for generosity. "A small one. With a fox. Or a ship. Or a fox who is a ship." Kaelin's mouth made an involuntary shape that was not a smile and very much wanted to be. He stood careful of distance. "Foxes rarely consent to being ships," he said. "They dislike the ocean's commentary." "What does the ocean say?" Mira asked, instantly caught. "It says everything at once," he replied and extended a gloved hand, not toward Mira but toward the wall. "Shall I show you?" Mira nodded so vigorously her blanket cloak slipped. She tugged it back up with a queen's dignity and scrambled onto a low bench. Selene stepped aside, curiosity and something warmer pricking under her ribs. Kaelin moved to the lamp, adjusted the shade with the knack of long practice, and lifted his hands into the cone of light. He did not remove his gloves. The lambskin became black cutouts against the glow. His fingers, long and precise, folded and unfurled in quick, economical motions. A fox leapt onto the wall, shadow ears pricked, tail like a brush dipped in night. He turned his wrists. The fox's tail elongated, curled into a question mark, and then, with a twitch that should have been impossible, became a sail. The fox ship bobbed across the uneven plaster, riding waves that were really his fingers rippling imperceptibly in the lamp's light. Mira gasped. "Do the ocean's voice," she whispered. Kaelin didn't make a sound. He tilted the shade until the flame hummed. The room listened and became a shore. The fox ship grew, its shadow sail billowing when he flexed two knuckles, and a gull appeared, all beak and wing, from the angle of his thumb and forefinger. The gull wheeled once and turned into a wolf with a huff of his palm opening. The wolf trotted a circle around the ship and sat, guardian and gossip in one. Selene felt it then, the same ache she had tasted when he sang. A tenderness he kept locked under armor, fluent in the language of things children trust. Pattern surprise, a trick that doesn't laugh at you as it works. "Again," Mira breathed, when the wolf lowered its head and dissolved into the corner where the light failed. "Make the moon want to swim." Kaelin obliged. A half-circle that became a boat that became a coin that became, with the smallest flick of his little finger, a smiling mouth. The moon took a drink and turned into a ring, and something in Selene's chest twinged. She looked away so the memory would not be seen and mistaken for a request. When the fox had found a burrow and the wolf had turned into a hill and the moon had tucked itself into a drawer Selene would later realize was only the space between two stones, Mira clapped once, solemnly, as if she had just been permitted to witness a state secret. "Again tomorrow," she decreed, and yawned so violently the decree fell apart. "Now bed," Selene said, scooping the blanket cloak around the tiny monarch's shoulders. Mira toddled to her, then stopped, pivoted toward Kaelin, and bowed with the serious grace of someone who had learned ceremony from a pigeon rookery. "Thank you for the shadows," she said. He inclined his head in reply, every line of his posture careful not to invite a step that might end badly. "Sleep," he said, and the word landed like a blessing disguised as an order. Thane appeared at the threshold long enough to exchange a glance with Selene that said I'll see her to the door without making it an arrest. The runner, redeemed by not breathing too loudly, followed. When they were alone again the room felt larger, not emptier. The candle had burned nearly to the saucer. The wick listed like a ship that had decided to rest. "You are not the monster they fear," Selene said quietly, because the truth wanted air and because the argument they'd been having deserved to be amended by what had just occurred. Kaelin's shoulders shifted under leather and restraint. "I am many things they fear," he said, "and a few they do not know enough to be afraid of. But I am not their bedtime." "That is not a sentence a monster would think to say," she answered. He looked at the wall where a fox had been a moment ago. The shadow, there was only shadow now. I remember being small, he said, so softly the lamps leaned to hear it. I remember a hand making wolves out of light. I remember believing that if you held your breath just right, the dark would hold its breath to match you and forget, for one perfect moment, that it meant to swallow everything. He glanced down at his gloves. I do not sing for anyone. I had forgotten I could. You didn't sing, Selene said. Not this time. No, he agreed. This time the work asked for a trick, not a song. They let that rest like a piece of glass that will cut you if you move too soon. Then Selene returned to the paper and tapped a set of lines half hidden by a water stain. We still disagree about the granary, she said, because it seemed important not to pretend the world had been solved by a fox with a sail. We do, he said. And we will present it to the council as if the council's opinion matters. And then I will do what keeps men from starving. And what keeps Evandra from starting a different fire while you put this one out? His mouth flattened. Yes. Selene waited a beat, then risked the small mercy the moment allowed. You don't have to be the only one putting out fires, she said. Even if you're the only one who can swallow them. He considered her. Measured, wary, something like grateful threaded through. You have a way of making my life sound like a choice, he said. It often is, she replied. Shaped by other people's mistakes, perhaps. But still yours. The last of the candle sighed into smoke. The room exhaled with it. Kaelin struck a taper and relit the lamps. The world regained edges. Enough for tonight, he said, in the tone that made enough feel like competence rather than surrender. Walk back with Captain Rook. Selene gathered the pages into stacks, aligning them with the neatness of someone who has learned that order is a small, stubborn spell. At the door she paused, hand on the lintel, and looked back at him. A man built of subtraction and secrets, who had made a fox go to sea so a child would believe the ocean could be talked into kindness. Strength, she said, is also knowing when to laugh in a fortress that forgot how. She nodded toward the wall. Thank you for reminding it. He did not smile, but the air near him felt as if gratitude had moved through it and left the scent of pine. Go, he said, gentler than his words, before Thane decides to carry you like a mislaid spear. Selene found the corridor warmer than stone should be. Thane fell into step with her, lantern low, the silence between them comfortable. He does that sometimes, the captain said at last, as if answering a question she hadn't asked. The shadows. Does he? Selene murmured. Not often. Thane's voice went softer, reverent by accident. Only when the walls are listening too hard. Selene glanced back once, at the door they'd left. Then she let the Citadel take her weight as she walked, and for the first time since climbing its stairs she felt as if the fortress had given an inch in return. Behind them, alone in the lamplight, Kaelin adjusted one page by the width of a thumbnail. He stood 3 paces from the table, remembering the way a fox becomes a ship if you bend your hands just so and refuse to let the dark speak first. He did not call this hope. He called it calibration. The kind a man makes when he suspects that the smallest battlefield might not be the only one worth winning after all. Chapter 7. The Sister's Warning. The fortress had always been full of whispers, but on the morning Lady Evandra arrived, even the stones seemed to still. Selene sensed it before she saw her. A pressure in the air, as though the corridors themselves held their breath. The high doors of the chapel opened, and there she was. Lady Evandra Duskbane walked like a flame that refused to bow to wind. Tall, cloaked in deep crimson robes embroidered with silver runes, she carried herself with the certainty of someone who had bent fate to her will. Her hair, the same raven black as Kaelin's, fell in smooth braids heavy with talismans that clinked like tiny bones when she moved. Her eyes, however, were colder than Kaelin's, steel rather than gold. The priests at her side bowed as though to a queen. Selene, standing in the shadows of the hall, did not. She felt the weight of Evandra's gaze all the same, sharp as a blade across the skin. Later, when the fortress was quieter, Selene found her waiting in the archive chambers, as though she had stepped out of the very stone. "You are the exile." Evandra's voice held no question, only disdain. "The wolfless girl Kaelin has gathered into his walls. Tell me, do you imagine yourself a savior to him?" Selene bristled. "I don't imagine anything. I am here because my niece needs me alive, and because your brother asked for my help." That earned a smile, thin and mirthless. "He asked for your help. Oh, little girl, my brother does not ask. He binds, he commands, he hungers. And when women come too near, they pay the price. I know this better than anyone, for it was my hands that sealed the curse upon him." The words chilled Selene more than the coldest wind that whipped through the battlements. "You did this." "I saved him," Evandra corrected. "Our bloodline carries a flaw, men who burn with strength until desire destroys them. Kaelin was not the first. He was merely the one I swore would not fall as others did. I bound him so he would never again be undone by a woman's touch." Selene swallowed hard. "You call that protection? It sounds like a prison." "Better a prison than a grave," Evandra replied, her voice sharp as shattered glass. Then she leaned closer, her perfume heavy with bitter herbs. "Leave him, exile. You are already poison to him. And to linger here will poison you as well." Selene wanted to retort, but Evandra's presence pressed like a storm against her ribs, choking the words in her throat. When she returned to Myra's chamber that evening, she found Kaelin pacing by the window, his golden eyes restless, watching the horizon where shadows pooled against the city walls. "They gather sooner than expected," he muttered half to himself. "Something stirs them." Selene hesitated, then asked softly, "Does it stir you as well?" He turned, his gaze sharp, searching her face. For a heartbeat she thought he might confess something, about the curse, about his sister, about the shadows he hunted in silence. But then his mouth hardened. "My sister spoke to you." Selene did not deny it. "She said you would destroy me. That women bring ruin to your bloodline." For the first time since she'd met him, Kaelin looked away. His jaw clenched, and shadows coiled faintly along his hands as if answering some inner turmoil. "There are truths," he said slowly, "that are heavier than any chain. Evandra bears them as warnings. I bear them as scars." Selene stepped closer, though her pulse raced. "And what am I to bear, Kaelin? Your silence? Or the truth?" His eyes met hers again, glowing, pained but alive. "If I give you the truth, Selene Arkwright, you may never look at me the same again." The torches guttered in a sudden draft. Outside, the night roared as if something vast pressed against the city's walls. And in that moment, Selene realized the fortress was not merely a place of stone and shadows. It was a battlefield of secrets, and Lady Evandra had just placed her in the crossfire. Chapter 8. Storm at the Gates. The warning bells split the night in two. Their clang rolled across the obsidian spires of the fortress and tumbled down into the streets of Veyr, where shutters slammed and mothers dragged children from alleys into cellars. The sound was old, older than the Citadel itself, a summons that meant only one thing. The shadows were rising. Selene jerked awake to Myra's frightened whimper. The child clutched at her, trembling beneath her blanket. The walls themselves seemed to hum with alarm as boots pounded past the door. Shouts filled the corridors, steel rang against steel, and somewhere above, the great gates groaned like beasts about to break. When Selene reached the battlements, the night stretched before her like an ocean of teeth. The shadow beasts were endless, eyes glowing like coals in the dark, forms half smoke, half flesh. They hurled themselves at the walls with snarls that curdled the blood. Their claws scraped stone, Their shrieks rattled every bone in her body. The Ebon Guard held the line, shields braced, spears thrusting over the parapets. Yet even their discipline trembled in the face of so many. And then Kaelin came. The Guardian strode onto the wall clad in black steel, his cloak snapping like a banner. His golden eyes blazed brighter than the torches, casting arcs of fire in the night. With a wordless cry, he leapt into the fray. Power answered him like a storm. Shadows bent to his will, lashing outward as whips of black flame that sliced through the beasts. His blade, etched with runes Selene half recognized, sang as it cleaved through flesh and smoke alike. For a moment the line held. But Selene saw it, even as the soldiers cheered. He was holding back. His movements were precise, controlled to the point of pain, as if each strike was tethered, as if he feared what would happen if he let go completely. The beasts pressed harder. One vaulted the wall, slamming a guard against the stone with bone-shattering force. Kaelin intercepted, ripping the creature apart with his claws. But when he turned, Selene saw his face was half shifted, the beast already clawing its way out from within. "Guardian!" the soldiers shouted. "The Guardian falters." "No," Selene whispered, gripping the stone, her heart pounding. He restrains himself. The tide of monsters seemed endless. The clang of iron drowned beneath their howls, and torches sputtered in their wake. Still Kaelin fought, even as blood streaked his jaw and his breath grew ragged. His blade fell again and again, but his hands trembled when the claws extended too far. His body fought itself as fiercely as the enemy before him. At last the bells rang cease. The shadow beasts, sensing some unseen signal, drew back into the night like a tide retreating from shore. They melted into the fog, leaving only blood, ruin, and silence in their wake. The battlements were slick with gore. The Ebon Guard slumped against the stone, panting, eyes wide with fear not of the beasts but of what they had just witnessed. "Why did he not unleash himself?" one whispered, voice shaking. "He could have ended them." "He grows weaker," another muttered darkly. "The curse eats at him. Perhaps the Guardian is no longer enough." Their words burned hotter than the chill wind. Selene wanted to shout that they were wrong, that his restraint was not weakness but sacrifice, but the truth sat heavy in her chest. She had seen the tremor in Kaelin's hands, the strain in his face, the battle against his own cursed blood. When he finally staggered back into the fortress, Selene was waiting. His armor was torn, his body bloodied, his breath harsh. One side of his face still bore the beast's snarl, golden eye rimmed with burning shadow. He leaned against the wall, clawed hand braced to keep himself standing. The air around him stank of iron and smoke. Selene stepped closer, against her better judgment. "You're bleeding." "It is nothing," he rasped, but his voice cracked on the lie. "You fight them and yourself." She hesitated, then added softly, "Is the curse your prison or your weapon?" His gaze met hers, sharp and haunted. For a heartbeat she thought he might answer. Instead he pushed past, cloak dragging blood across the stones. Behind him, the fortress whispered with unease. The people of Veyr had seen their guardian bleed. They had seen his restraint. And in a city built on faith in its monster slayer, doubt had begun to gnaw like a worm in the heart of the walls. Selene gathered Mira close that night, staring at the horizon where the beasts had vanished. The city whispered weakness, but she knew the truth was worse. Kaelin's curse was no longer just binding him. It was being used against him. And someone somewhere was pulling the strings. Chapter 9: A Forbidden Touch. The fortress had scarcely caught its breath from the last siege when the shadows slipped inside. No horns announced their arrival this time, no clanging bells to rouse the city. They came like smoke through cracks, formless until they gathered enough hate to take shape. Selene woke to Myra's scream. She was on her feet before thought could form, heart hammering as she flung open the chamber door. The corridor beyond was a storm of chaos. Guards shouting, steel ringing against unseen claws, torches snuffed as though the night itself drew breath. And in the center, Mira, dragged backward by a tendril of black smoke that solidified into claws. "No!" Selene's cry tore through the din. She sprinted, but Kaelin reached her first. Out of the shadows he came like a tempest, blade flashing, golden eyes burning brighter than the torches. He cut down the beast clutching Mira, his strike so powerful it split stone. The child tumbled free into Selene's arms, but Kaelin took the brunt of the counterstrike. A claw raked across his chest, deep enough to spray blood. He staggered but did not fall, until another tendril lashed around his arm, dragging him toward the floor. "Kaelin!" The guardian fought, but Selene saw it. The way his knees buckled, the way his blade faltered. The curse stirred, golden fire bleeding into his wounds, half-shift already tearing through muscle and bone. His breath came ragged, more beast than man. Evandra's warning rang in Selene's head. "Leave him. Women bring ruin to his bloodline." But ruin was already here. She laid Mira down behind her, whispering for her to stay hidden, then dropped beside Kaelin. Blood pooled dark across the stones. His eyes flickered, trapped between human anguish and feral rage. "Don't!" he growled, his claws snapping out. "Selene, don't touch me." "I won't watch you die," she snapped back, her hands already tearing herbs from her pouch, crushing them with trembling fingers. "Not while I can still fight for you." Her palms pressed to the wound. Heat seared her skin, not from blood but from the curse itself. Fire coiling under his flesh, begging to be unleashed. Kaelin arched, a snarl ripping from his throat as the beast inside surged forward. His body contorted. One arm stretched, claws lengthening into blackened talons. His teeth sharpened into fangs, breath coming in ragged growls. It was the same monstrous half-shift that had terrified her in the archives, but this time she did not let go. "Kaelin," she whispered fiercely, leaning close. "Look at me." Not at the beast. At me. For a terrible heartbeat she thought she'd lost him. His golden eyes burned wild, unfocused, ready to tear. Then slowly they found hers. Her hands should have triggered the curse completely. Instead something shifted. The wildness dimmed, just enough for him to hold on. His claws trembled, poised inches from her throat, before lowering to the blood-slick floor. The half-shift halted. Selene barely breathed, her pulse wild as she held his gaze. "See, I don't destroy you." His body quaked under her touch, sweat mixing with blood, but his voice came hoarse, astonished. "You steady it. No one has ever." Her tears blurred the edges of his face, but her voice was steady. "Then remember this. You're not alone in the fight anymore." For a moment the world narrowed to the press of her hands, the heat of his body beneath them, the wild rhythm of his heart struggling to stay human. In that fragile balance between curse and salvation, something else sparked, something unspoken, dangerous and tender. When at last the shadows retreated, their forms dissolving into ash, silence swept the corridor. Guards stumbled to their feet, muttering prayers of disbelief. But Selene and Kaelin remained locked in that impossible truth. Her touch had not damned him. It had saved him. Kaelin's breathing slowed. His claws retracted, his form shrinking back into the man she knew. He stared at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as an exile, not as a trespasser, but as someone who had crossed the line none dared approach. "Selene." His voice broke like a blade under strain. "What are you?" She swallowed hard, her hands still against his chest, her heart answering what her lips could not. "I'm someone who refuses to let you carry this alone." And in the haunted silence of the fortress, where priests whispered curses and soldiers whispered doubts, the Guardian and the Wolfless exile shared a revelation no shadow could erase. That perhaps the curse was not only chains. Perhaps it was waiting for the one who could break them. Chapter 10. Betrayal of Blood. The city of Veyr had not known true silence for generations. Bells, markets, the cries of merchants, these were its heartbeat. But on the night Lady Evandra struck, silence fell heavy and absolute. Even the torches guttered low as if reluctant to burn. Selene felt it first. The stillness. The breath before calamity. She was with Mira, coaxing her to sleep, when the air in the chamber thickened, tasting of ash and old iron. The runes etched into the fortress walls flickered weakly, their protective glow faltering. Then the wards shattered. It came like the sound of glass breaking across the heavens, a single deafening crack that echoed through every stone of the Citadel. The city gasped as one. Selene rushed to the window in time to see the shimmering barrier around the outer walls, wards older than memory, splinter into shards of light before dissolving into nothing. And the shadows poured in. They came like a flood unleashed, 1,000 howls rising in unison, black smoke devouring the streets. The ebon guards scrambled to form lines, but the beasts were already inside the city. Torches winked out as homes were swallowed whole. Kalen burst into the hall, blood still on his tunic from the last battle. His eyes burned gold, his voice sharp with command. "Evacuate the western wing. Get the children below." But the words faltered as Lady Evandra stepped from the shadows. She was clad in her crimson robes, the silver runes etched into them glowing like coals. Her expression was calm, too calm, her steel-gray eyes cold with resolve. Around her, the priests chanted low, their hands bleeding from the rites they had just performed. "Evandra!" Kalen's voice dropped into a growl. "What have you done?" "I have saved us," she said, her tone eerily serene. "You would not listen, brother. You let the exile place her hands on you. Let her unbind the careful chains I wove. Do you not see? If left unchecked, you will destroy this city. You've doomed it." Kalen roared, striding toward her. Shadows writhed at his heels as if echoing his fury. The wards kept them at bay. The wards kept you at bay. Evandra snapped, her calm shattering at last. "Do you think I did not see it? Every year you grew stronger. Every year the beast clawed harder at your cage. You will not be its master, Kalen. You will be its puppet, and when that day comes, all of Veyr will burn." Selene's voice cut through the crackling air. "This isn't about protection. This is about control." Evandra's eyes swung toward her, sharp as a blade. "You know nothing, exile." But Selene did know. She saw it in the tremor of Evandra's hands, in the brittle edge of her voice. This was not the calm of a savior. It was the desperation of a woman who feared losing the one thing she could not chain. Her brother's heart. "You cursed him because you were afraid," Selene said, stepping closer despite Kalen's warning growl. "Afraid of losing him. Afraid of being alone. You bound him not for the city's sake, but for yours." Evandra's mask cracked. For an instant pain flickered across her face. Grief raw and ancient. Then rage swallowed it whole. "You will not take him from me," she hissed, and with a gesture of her bloodied hand, the fortress shook. The priest's chant rose to a fever pitch. Runes across the chamber flared, not with light, but with darkness, an inversion of every protective sigil Selene had studied. Kalen staggered as though struck, his claws tearing through the air as if fighting invisible chains. His body half shifted against his will, the curse pulling at him more violently than ever before. Selene rushed to his side, gripping his arm despite the shadows sparking at her touch. "Kalen, fight her. She's using the curse against you." His eyes glowed wildly, torn between human and beast, fury and despair. "She is my sister, and she would see the city burn rather than lose her hold on you. Selene cried. Outside, screams rose as the shadow beasts devoured the first ring of streets. Fire licked the sky. The fortress itself quaked beneath their claws. Cailan fell to his knees, torn between blood and bond, curse and choice. Evandra's voice echoed above the chaos, cold and resolute. Better a ruined city than a ruined brother. Selene's heart clenched. For the first time, she understood the true tragedy. This was not only a battle against shadows, but against love twisted into fear. Evandra's curse had never been about protecting Veyr. It was about binding Cailan so tightly that no one, not even fate, could take him from her. And now, she would let the world burn to prove it. Chapter 11. Heart against darkness. The city was burning. Flames curled against the black horizon, smoke strangling the stars, while the wails of Veyr's people twisted with the howls of shadow beasts. The ancient fortress groaned beneath the weight of the siege, obsidian walls slick with ash and blood. And at the heart of it, Cailan Duskbane fell to his knees. His body writhed, caught between forms. Claws shredded his gauntlets, golden eyes fractured by streaks of black. His voice, half growl, half cry, was not human, not beast, but something torn and raw. Evandra's forbidden rites tightened around him like iron chains. The priest's chants thundered in the distance, binding, pulling, trying to drown him in the curse she had sown years ago. Selene dropped beside him, refusing to flinch as his claws scraped sparks from the stone mere inches from her face. Cailan, look at me. His head snapped toward her, lips peeled back in a snarl. Shadows boiled off his skin. His body trembling with the urge to tear, to destroy. Soldiers drew back in terror. Even the ebon guard, sworn to him, faltered. But Selene did not move. You are not her puppet, she cried above the chaos, pressing her hands to his blood-slick shoulders. You are not the beast she fears. You are more than her curse. Fight, Cailan, fight with me. The world narrowed. For a breathless instant, only her voice existed, her warmth against the storm, her defiance sharper than any blade. The beast lunged in his veins, but her eyes caught his, steady, unafraid. Something broke. With a roar that shook the ramparts, Cailan surged to his feet. The shift did not consume him, it completed him. Golden fire laced through his veins, not devouring but balancing. His claws gleamed like forged steel. His body a seamless weave of man and wolf. Where once he was torn between, now he was whole. Selene's breath hitched, awe and terror mingling in her chest. Cailan! He turned toward the battlefield, voice deeper than thunder. Stay behind me. The shadows came in waves, shrieking, clawing, endless. Cailan met them head-on. Each strike was devastating. His blade swept arcs of fire. His claws rend through smoke flesh like parchment. No longer restrained, no longer half-shifted. He fought as something new. Not a cursed man, not a monster, but both. Selene refused to remain behind. She seized torches, flung burning oil, recited half-remembered runes from the manuscripts she had studied. Together they moved as one. Her fire driving the beasts into his reach, his strength carving them apart. At one point, a shadow beast nearly tore her down. Cailan's snarl split the night as he hurled himself across the distance, his body shielding hers. For a heartbeat, his golden gaze met hers again, softer this time despite the battlefield. You steady me, he said hoarsely, before turning to strike down another foe. Hours felt like centuries. Blood slicked the cobblestones, torches burned low, screams echoed through shattered gates. But for every shadow that fell, another rose. Selene's arms ached, her throat raw from shouting, yet she stayed at his side, voice constant even as strength fled. Cailan, hold the line. You are not alone. You are more than this curse. And each time she called, he answered. His roars carried her words, amplifying them into power. The soldiers who had faltered began to rally, their courage reignited by the sight of their guardian no longer shackled by fear. Together, Selene and Kaelin carved a path through the heart of the darkness, their bond an anchor stronger than Evandra's rights. When dawn's first light broke the horizon, the shadows hissed, recoiling like smoke from flame. The survivors of Veyr stood bloodied but unbroken, staring in stunned silence at the impossible. Their guardian still standing, beast and man bound in harmony, the exile at his side. Selene's chest heaved, her hands trembling as she looked upon him. Kaelin's form still bore claws and fangs, but his eyes were clear, no longer consumed. "You did it," she whispered, half in awe, half in disbelief. "No," Kaelin rasped, his voice rough but steady. His gaze softened as it lingered on her. "We did." The city's walls still smoked, Evandra's betrayal still hung like ash in the air. But for the first time in years, hope stirred. For the first time, Kaelin fought not as curse, nor as victim, but as guardian of Veyr, anchored by the heart that refused to let him fall. Chapter 12 Dawn. The first sound after the last scream was the quiet tick of ash landing on stone. It fell like grey snow across the Citadel's ramparts, softened the edges of shattered merlons, settled on bent spears and scorched banners. Beneath, the city remembered how to breathe. Doors opened a cautious hand's width. Lanterns blinked to life as if waking with a start from a terrible dream. Veyr, which had gone to sleep afraid it would not open its eyes, found dawn waiting anyway. Kaelin Duskbane stood at the highest parapet, blood stiff on his tunic, smoke threading his hair. The thing under his skin, the old wildness that had once obeyed fear before it obeyed him, lay quiet as a great hound after the hunt. His hands, human, were nicked and raw. Faint crescent shadows where claws had been still marked the nail beds like memories that would not wholly fade. He flexed his fingers as if testing a new instrument and glanced beside him. Selene was there, shawl torn and singed at the fringe, Mira asleep against her shoulder with the reckless trust only children and the forgiven can manage. The child's breath warmed the hollow of Selene's neck. Soot smudged the line of Selene's jaw into a crescent. Her eyes, rimmed red from smoke and tears, were steady. The dawn stole colors back from the night and gave them to her first. Behind them, the Ebon Guard gathered in uneven lines, bandaged, dazed, alive. The captain, Thane Rook, sank to one knee, and then, one by one like a tide no wall would hold, the rest followed, not from ritual but relief. No trumpet called it. The city did not need ceremony to know what it had seen. Their guardian, no longer a rumor with teeth, standing whole because he had refused to stand alone. Selene slid her hand into Kaelin's. He stared at the meeting of their fingers as if it were a new script and he a boy learning to read, then gripped back. Nothing inside him surged to punish the closeness. Her touch made the embers bank and glow instead of flaring, as if heat had remembered it could warm without burning. "Still afraid?" she asked, mouth tilting. "Of many things," he admitted. The corner of his own mouth tried to remember a smile and almost managed it. "Not of you." Mira stirred and squinted up at him, lashes clumped with tears and ash. "Sing," she croaked, so hoarse the word seemed more wish than sound. Kaelin huffed a breath that was almost a laugh. "The city will revolt if I command it to wake to my voice," he murmured. "Then don't command," Selene said. "Offer." He turned his head to the wind so the sound would drift down instead of carry outward, and let the lullaby find him. The melody was older than the Citadel and gentler than stone knew how to be. It threaded the air around their little knot of three, made a circle that felt, for a handful of heartbeats, untouchable. Soldiers who had forgotten how to be sons shut their eyes. A clerk with ink on his knuckles cupped his hand to his mouth and wept behind it. Even the ash seemed to fall more quietly. When the song ended, Work returned like a friend whose knock you finally answer. Orders went out in Thane's measured baritone. Squads to the eastern quarter. Teams to lift rubble from the market street. Runners to carry lists of the missing, the found, the injured, the dead. Priests moved in pairs, some cowed, some bristling, their eyes searching for Lady Evandra's crimson among the ruin. They did not find it. Only a severed braid of black hair bound with silver thread, a scatter of cracked talismans, and a blood-dark smear across the paving stones near the river gate remained where she had last stood. Alive? Thane asked quietly. Kaelin's jaw worked, grief and history and anger warring in the tiny muscle beside his mouth. Or clever, he said, which is not the same as alive and sometimes worse. Selene had no answer kind enough for a sister and honest enough for a city. She pressed his hand. He did not say 3 paces. The rule that had kept disaster at bay now felt like a superstition someone else had believed on his behalf. They descended into the city with the first clean light. At the base of the Citadel stairs, a baker pushed a crate of bread into a guard's stunned hands and then, seeing Myra's smeared face, broke a heel off the top loaf and offered it up with a shaking laugh. "Payment later," he said, which in the language of the poor means, "This one's on us." An old woman swatted Kaelin's arm, not hard, not soft, and said, "Next time shout earlier," and then dusted his sleeve like stubborn ash was any match for grandmothering. A boy who could not have been more than 9 held himself very exactly still until Kaelin's eyes found him, then bowed, knuckles white, courage loud in the silence of it. Kaelin bowed back, a heartbeat lower. The outer wards had fallen like a string cut in several places at once. The floodwater of shadow had left debris where it receded. Torn awnings, a shattered cart, a goat bleating as if telling the entire quarter that survival was an accomplishment it intended to be thanked for. Selene knelt in the mud with the masons at the east gate and read the old hand's instructions from a stone, so weathered the letters huddled together like elderly friends. "Here," she told them, and drew the mirrored curve with a charcoal nub on her palm because paper would not keep its shape. "You subtract the second thread when the river rises past the third riser. Borrow from the granary brace to relieve the bend. Give the arch a place to breathe. The priests will wail," a mason predicted. "They wail better than they read," Thane said, and the men laughed, a dry sound that coughed and then took hold. They moved like this through the day. Repair, triage, kind lies told so the truth would have time to become bearable. In the market, Selene bandaged a fishmonger's gashed hand and, when the woman refused to let herself cry because her children were watching, cried on her behalf and handed her a reason. "Smoke," she said solemnly, "hates eyes." In the rookery, Mira counted pigeons with the runner and learned she could whisper kings into being and then feed them crumbs. In the cloister, a group of priests tried to bar Selene's passage with rule, rank, and tone. Kaelin arrived behind her like a shadow that had learned to knock. He didn't raise his voice. He told them, in the even patience he used for walls that had forgotten their purpose, that the wards would serve bread before doctrine, and that any man who tried to unlearn that lesson would be reassigned to counting spoons. They did not mention Evandra's name. Kaelin did not ask if Selene thought his sister dead. Selene did not tell him that absence can be a cruelty sharper than loss. There are conversations that cannot be carried in a city's hearing. They kept those for stone and night. Late afternoon found them in his study, the room made out of trying. Sun angled in through the high window and landed on the table with its map of scars and charcoal ghosts. The sketches of bodies and sigils lay where he had left them nights ago, a priest of his own skin at his private altar. Selene's fingers hovered above a drawing where a mirrored glyph had been struck through and redrawn a fraction of a degree away. "Balance brutality with precision," she said softly, repeating the sentence she had written him on a scrap of paper and hid beneath his cup days earlier. "You've been brutal to yourself for so long that precision will feel like mercy." He took off his gloves. If a sound belonged to the act, it would have been the click of a lock after years of misremembering the key. He set the gloves on the table and turned his palms up, scars a pale map of old mistakes. She laid her hands over his, light, deliberate, certain. Heat traveled up her arms. Not fire, not threat. A hum like a plucked string settling into true. Selene. His name for her had different weight now. Not warning. Not command. Call and an answer in one. Yes. What you did, in the corridor. I have never stopped to change once it began. He smiled, crooked with wonder more than joy. Never. And then you. We, she corrected. We, he allowed. He looked at their joined hands the way soldiers look at bread after battle, as if the simple fact of it were holy. The city will want a speech. It will, she admitted. And then it will want water. And after that it will want for us not to forget water matters more than speeches. He huffed that almost laugh. Come with me, he said. They climbed to the south parapet where councils had been held, verdicts read, and lovers dared to be seen. People gathered slowly, shy at first, then bold. Shopkeepers with sleeves rolled, children whose hair smelled of smoke and honey, the guard in patched ranks. Thane stood a measured pace behind Kaelin. Selene stood at his side, Mira clutching Selene's skirt in one hand and the wood-carved dog in the other. Kaelin stepped forward, and the murmur laid itself down. I will not tell you that last night was mercy dressed in fear, he began, voice carrying without effort. It was not. We bled for other people's choices and for my sister's belief that love can be welded into a lock. A muscle flickered in his jaw. He did not look at Selene, but the air between them thickened with a truth that did not need an audience. We survived because the city decided to stand inside its own skin. Because men who never spoke to one another passed buckets. Because a child shouted at a pigeon until it believed it was a king and then fed it crumbs it did not deserve. Because some of you, he glanced at the guard, remembered that the oath you took was to the people within these walls and not the walls themselves. A ripple of sound, half laughter, half something that could become pride if tended, moved through the crowd. We will rebuild, Kaelin said simply. We will redo the ward strings the way the old hands meant them, not the way we pretended to understand them. We will serve bread before doctrine. We will not mistake fear for wisdom. He paused, then added, and I will not rule this city at arm's length any longer. The curse I carry is changed. It does not own my body. It answers to my will. It steadies under a hand that refuses to be afraid of it. His gaze found Selene then, unmistakable, unguarded, and the city saw it, the recognition exchanged like a token. A murmur, soft, surprised, not unkind, slid outward like light. Arkwright, he said, turning fully toward her in front of them all. The archives called you Exile. The mountain called you Wolfless. I call you Reader of the Wards and Anchor of the East. If you'll have a title, his mouth tilted. If you won't, then I'll settle for your company and your corrections. Selene could not stop the breath that punched out of her chest. She dipped her head. Neither court bow nor mountain nod, something of her own making. I'll have the work, she said. Titles get dusty. Then we'll keep it moving, Kaelin replied, and a laugh gusted through the crowd. Real, startled, the kind that makes a city believe itself again. It was not the only gift that found her that day. When they returned to the landing above the cooper's yard where her old room still smelled faintly of boiled willow and resolve, a small parcel waited on the step. No seal. No note. Inside, wrapped in a square of clean muslin, lay a braided silver ring, scuffed and familiar. The Arkwright crest so shallow you felt it more than saw it. Pell the pawnbroker was nowhere to be found, but down the alley a door shut softly, and a man with a hawk's beak of a nose pretended very hard to be interested in arranging pocket watches that no longer ticked. A boy who could not have been more than 9 held himself very exactly still until Kaelin's eyes found him, then bowed, knuckles white, courage loud in the silence of it. Kaelin bowed back, a heartbeat lower. The outer wards had fallen like a string cut in several places at once. The floodwater of shadow had left debris where it receded. Torn awnings, a shattered cart, a goat bleating as if telling the entire quarter that survival was an accomplishment it intended to be thanked for. Selene knelt in the mud with the masons at the east gate and read the old hand's instructions from a stone, so weathered the letters huddled together like elderly friends. "Here," she told them, and drew the mirrored curve with a charcoal nub on her palm because paper would not keep its shape. "You subtract the second thread when the river rises past the third riser. Borrow from the granary brace to relieve the bend. Give the arch a place to breathe. The priests will wail," a mason predicted. "They wail better than they read," Thane said, and the men laughed, a dry sound that coughed and then took hold. They moved like this through the day. Repair, triage, kind lies told so the truth would have time to become bearable. In the market, Selene bandaged a fishmonger's gashed hand and, when the woman refused to let herself cry because her children were watching, cried on her behalf and handed her a reason. "Smoke," she said solemnly, "hates eyes." In the rookery, Mira counted pigeons with the runner and learned she could whisper kings into being and then feed them crumbs. In the cloister, a group of priests tried to bar Selene's passage with rule, rank, and tone. Kalen arrived behind her like a shadow that had learned to knock. He didn't raise his voice. He told them, in the even patience he used for walls that had forgotten their purpose, that the wards would serve bread before doctrine, and that any man who tried to unlearn that lesson would be reassigned to counting spoons. They did not mention Evandra's name. Kalen did not ask if Selene thought his sister dead. Selene did not tell him that absence can be a cruelty sharper than loss. There are conversations that cannot be carried in a city's hearing. They kept those for stone and night. Late afternoon found them in his study, the room made out of trying. Sun angled in through the high window and landed on the table with its map of scars and charcoal ghosts. The sketches of bodies and sigils lay where he had left them nights ago, a priest of his own skin at his private altar. Selene's fingers hovered above a drawing where a mirrored glyph had been struck through and redrawn a fraction of a degree away. "Balance brutality with precision," she said softly, repeating the sentence she had written him on a scrap of paper and hid beneath his cup days earlier. "You've been brutal to yourself for so long that precision will feel like mercy." He took off his gloves. If a sound belonged to the act, it would have been the click of a lock after years of misremembering the key. He set the gloves on the table and turned his palms up, scars a pale map of old mistakes. She laid her hands over his, light, deliberate, certain. Heat traveled up her arms. Not fire, not threat. A hum like a plucked string settling into true. Selene. His name for her had different weight now. Not warning. Not command. Call and an answer in one. "Yes. What you did, in the corridor. I have never stopped to change once it began." He smiled, crooked with wonder more than joy. "Never. And then you." "We," she corrected. "We," he allowed. He looked at their joined hands the way soldiers look at bread after battle, as if the simple fact of it were holy. "The city will want a speech." "It will," she admitted. "And then it will want water. And after that it will want for us not to forget water matters more than speeches." He huffed that almost laugh. "Come with me," he said. They climbed to the south parapet where councils had been held, verdicts read, and lovers dared to be seen. People gathered slowly, shy at first, then bold. Shopkeepers with sleeves rolled, children whose hair smelled of smoke and honey, the guard in patched ranks. Thane stood a measured pace behind Kalen. Selene stood at his side, Mira clutching Selene's skirt in one hand and the wood-carved dog in the other. Kalen stepped forward, and the murmur laid itself down. "I will not tell you that last night was mercy dressed in fear," he began, voice carrying without effort. "It was not. We bled for other people's choices and for my sister's belief that love can be welded into a lock." A muscle flickered in his jaw. He did not look at Selene, but the air between them thickened with a truth that did not need an audience. We survived because the city decided to stand inside its own skin. Because men who never spoke to one another passed buckets. Because a child shouted at a pigeon until it believed it was a king and then fed it crumbs it did not deserve. Because some of you, he glanced at the guard, remembered that the oath you took was to the people within these walls and not the walls themselves. A ripple of sound, half laughter, half something that could become pride if tended, moved through the crowd. We will rebuild, Kaelin said simply. We will redo the ward strings the way the old hands meant them, not the way we pretended to understand them. We will serve bread before doctrine. We will not mistake fear for wisdom. He paused, then added, and I will not rule this city at arm's length any longer. The curse I carry is changed. It does not own my body. It answers to my will. It steadies under a hand that refuses to be afraid of it. His gaze found Selene then, unmistakable, unguarded, and the city saw it, the recognition exchanged like a token. A murmur, soft, surprised, not unkind, slid outward like light. Arkwright, he said, turning fully toward her in front of them all. The archives called you Exile. The mountain called you Wolfless. I call you Reader of the Wards and Anchor of the East. If you'll have a title, his mouth tilted. If you won't, then I'll settle for your company and your corrections. Selene could not stop the breath that punched out of her chest. She dipped her head. Neither court bow nor mountain nod, something of her own making. I'll have the work, she said. Titles get dusty. Then we'll keep it moving, Kaelin replied, and a laugh gusted through the crowd. Real, startled, the kind that makes a city believe itself again. It was not the only gift that found her that day. When they returned to the landing above the cooper's yard where her old room still smelled faintly of boiled willow and resolve, a small parcel waited on the step. No seal. No note. Inside, wrapped in a square of clean muslin, lay a braided silver ring, scuffed and familiar. The Arkwright crest so shallow you felt it more than saw it. Pell the pawnbroker was nowhere to be found, but down the alley a door shut softly, and a man with a hawk's beak of a nose pretended very hard to be interested in arranging pocket watches that no longer ticked.